I found my son sitting in absolute silence on the freezing stone steps of his own home. He was holding his little daughter asleep in his arms with 2 suitcases tossed beside him in the wet grass. Her rich father had changed the locks and put them out on the street. He thought he had won. He never knew I had spent 12 months quietly preparing for this exact morning. It was time he learned what a quiet man is capable of doing. My name is Tyrone Carver, and I am 70 years old. I spent my life building things from the ground up and keeping my head down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect bloodlines from people who thought their money made them untouchable. The screech of the worn brake pads on my battered Ford truck cut through the heavy morning fog. It was exactly 5 in the morning. The air was thick and biting, carrying a bitter chill that seeped straight into the bones. I parked outside the massive iron gates of the sprawling suburban estate. Through the dense mist, the sprawling property looked like a cold fortress. My son DeAndre sat hunched on the bottom step of the grand entrance. He was shivering violently in a thin jacket. His large hands were wrapped protectively around his young 4-year-old daughter Nyla, who remained completely asleep against his chest. 2 designer suitcases sat discarded and soaking wet in the manicured grass near the driveway. DeAndre looked up at my approaching headlights with eyes that held absolute devastation. He had sacrificed 10 years of his life for those deeply ungrateful people securely locked inside that house. William Stanford stood safely positioned behind his reinforced glass front door. He was flanked by a highly paid private locksmith who was actively finishing installing brand new heavy steel deadbolts on the front entrance of the property. William pressed a button on the wall and delivered a brutal and calculated monologue through the external intercom system. His voice echoed across the quiet neighborhood, dripping with pure arrogance and elitism. He mocked DeAndre and his humble background with every breath. William laughed at the notion that a man from a working-class neighborhood ever thought he could truly belong in a family of such profound wealth and endless influence. He explicitly stated that the house, the commercial architectural business, and the child all belonged exclusively to the Stanford bloodline now. DeAndre was nothing more than a temporary employee who had outlived his basic usefulness to their grand corporate legacy. Victoria stood right over the left shoulder of her father during this entire vicious speech. She kept her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She looked down at the freezing man she had married and chose the immense wealth of her family over her own husband without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. Her face held absolute apathy. She offered no defense for the father of her child and no comfort for the man who loved her deeply. DeAndre was completely shattered by this utter betrayal. He trembled as he stared up at the massive glass doors. He had just logged into his phone and discovered that his business accounts were entirely frozen. William had used his banking connections to lock DeAndre out of his own architectural firm, suffocating his finances before tossing him onto the freezing pavement. The life DeAndre had built with his own 2 hands was stolen in a single night by a man who viewed human beings as completely disposable assets. He looked down at Nyla and wept silently. His heavy heart broke entirely under the deeply crushing weight of knowing he could not currently provide a safe roof or a warm bed for his precious little girl tonight. William continued to sneer from the warmth of his grand foyer. He truly believed he had crushed my son into dust and erased our family name from his luxurious world. He thought he was dealing with weak men who would fold under the pressure of his vast empire. I did not shout at the massive glass doors. I did not bang my fists on the expensive reinforced windows or hurl curses at William Stanford through the cold morning air. I simply stood there on the pavement and stared directly into his eyes with absolute calmness. My deep silence unnerved the arrogant tycoon far more than any display of physical violence ever could have. He wanted me to scream and validate his belief that we were nothing but uncultured thugs who belonged on the street. I refused to give him that pathetic satisfaction. I slowly walked up the wet driveway with measured and deliberate steps. I slowly picked up the heavy soaked suitcases that held the remaining fragments of the broken life of my son. I turned my back to the mansion and ignored the venomous insults still spilling from the intercom. I walked straight back toward my battered old Ford truck parked near the grand iron gates. I opened the passenger door very carefully so the harsh, loud creak of the old metal would not disturb the sleeping child. I looked at DeAndre, who was completely frozen in shock and paralyzed by the magnitude of this profound personal disaster. He was waiting for me to express profound anger or devastating disappointment. I offered neither. I looked at my brilliant boy, and issued a single and incredibly calm command that cut perfectly through the freezing morning mist. "Get in the truck now, son." I said the words with the firm certainty of a man who already knew the exact outcome of the war that was about to begin. We were permanently leaving this toxic house behind forever today. The next time we faced these arrogant people, we would dictate the rules entirely on our own strict and unyielding terms. As DeAndre numbly climbed into the dark cabin and gently buckled little Nyla into her secure car seat, I reached deep into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled out a cheap, untraceable burner phone that I had specifically purchased several weeks prior for this precise moment. I quickly typed a single short message to my brilliant corporate attorney, Gavin Thorne. "Initiate Phase 1. I hit send and watched the screen completely go black. Instantly, the personal smartphone of DeAndre lit up the entire cabin with a blindingly bright, flashing notification. He stared at the glowing screen in utter horror. Victoria had just ruthlessly filed an entirely fabricated emergency ex parte motion with the local county court. She maliciously claimed that DeAndre was a violent, unstable man actively attempting to kidnap her precious child across state lines. She was deliberately triggering an immediate and highly aggressive police manhunt for my son. She intended to have him viciously arrested before the sun could even rise to secure her total dominance. I slowly gripped the cold steering wheel. The silent adjustment had now officially started, and they had absolutely no idea what massive storm was rapidly approaching them right now. I found my son sitting in absolute silence on the freezing stone steps of his own home, holding his little daughter asleep in his arms. His wealthy father-in-law had changed the locks and put them out on the street. He thought he had won. He never knew. I had spent 12 months quietly preparing for this exact morning. It was time he learned what a quiet man is truly capable of doing. My name is Tyrone Carver, and I am 70 years old. I spent my entire life building things from the ground up and keeping my head down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your bloodline from people who thought their money made them untouchable. The harsh screech of the worn brake pads on my battered Ford truck violently cut through the heavy morning fog. It was exactly 5 in the morning. The air was thick and biting, carrying a bitter chill that seeped straight into the bones. I parked outside the massive, iron gates of the sprawling suburban estate. Through the dense mist, the immense property looked like a cold, hostile fortress. My son DeAndre sat hunched on the bottom step of the grand entrance. He was shivering violently in a thin jacket. His large hands were wrapped protectively around his young 4-year-old daughter Nyla, who remained completely asleep against his chest. 2 designer suitcases sat discarded and soaking wet in the manicured grass near the massive driveway. DeAndre looked up at my approaching headlights with dark eyes that held absolute devastation. He had sacrificed 10 years of his life for those deeply ungrateful people securely locked inside that massive house. William Stanford stood safely positioned behind his reinforced glass front door. He was flanked by a highly paid private locksmith who was actively finishing installing brand new heavy steel deadbolts on the main entrance of the property. William pressed a button on the wall and delivered a brutal and calculated monologue through the external intercom system. His voice echoed across the quiet neighborhood, dripping with pure arrogance and elitism. He mocked DeAndre and his humble background with every single breath. William laughed at the absurd notion that a man from a working-class neighborhood ever thought he could truly belong in a family of such profound wealth and endless influence. He explicitly stated that the house, the commercial architectural business, and the child all belonged exclusively to the Stanford bloodline. Now, DeAndre was nothing more than a temporary employee who had outlived his basic usefulness to their grand corporate legacy. Victoria stood right over the left shoulder of her father during this entire vicious speech. She kept her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She looked down at the freezing man she had married and chose the immense wealth of her family over her own husband, without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. Her face held absolute apathy. She offered no defense for the father of her child and no comfort for the man who loved her deeply. DeAndre was completely shattered by this utter betrayal. He trembled as he stared up at the massive glass doors. He had just logged into his phone and discovered that his business accounts were entirely frozen. William had used his banking connections to lock DeAndre out of his own architectural firm, suffocating his finances before tossing him onto the freezing pavement. The life DeAndre had built with his own two hands was stolen in a single night by a man who viewed human beings as completely disposable assets. He looked down at Nyla and wept silently. His heavy heart broke entirely under the deeply crushing weight of knowing he could not currently provide a safe roof or a warm bed for his precious little girl tonight. William continued to sneer from the warmth of his grand foyer. He truly believed he had crushed my son into dust and erased our family name from his luxurious world. He thought he was dealing with men who would fold under the pressure of his empire. I did not shout at the massive glass doors. I did not bang my heavy fists on the expensive reinforced windows or hurl angry curses at William Stanford through the cold morning air. I simply stood there on the damp pavement and stared directly into his eyes with absolute calmness. My deep silence unnerved the arrogant tycoon far more than any display of physical violence ever could have. He wanted me to scream and validate his ignorant belief that we were nothing but uncultured thugs who belonged on the street. I completely refused to give him that pathetic satisfaction. I slowly walked up the wet concrete driveway with measured and deliberate steps. I leaned down and effortlessly picked up the heavy soaked suitcases that held the remaining shattered fragments of the broken life of my son. I turned my back to the luxury mansion and completely ignored the venomous insults still spilling rapidly from the digital intercom. I walked straight back toward my battered old Ford truck parked securely. Near the grand iron gates, I opened the passenger door very carefully, making sure the harsh, loud creak of the old metal would not disturb the sleeping child. I looked at DeAndre, who was completely frozen in shock and totally paralyzed by the magnitude of this profound personal disaster. He was waiting for me to express profound anger or devastating disappointment. I offered neither of those expected emotional reactions. I looked at my brilliant boy and issued a single and incredibly calm command that cut perfectly through the freezing morning mist. "Get in the truck now, son." I said the words with the firm certainty of a man who already knew the exact outcome of the brutal war that was about to begin. We were permanently leaving this toxic house behind. As DeAndre numbly climbed into the dark cabin and gently buckled little Nyla into her secure car seat, I reached deep into the pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled out a cheap, untraceable burner phone that I had specifically purchased several weeks prior. For this precise moment, I quickly typed a single short message to my brilliant corporate attorney, Gavin Thorne: "Initiate Phase 1." I hit send and watched the screen completely go black. Instantly, the personal smartphone of DeAndre lit up the entire cabin with a blindingly bright, flashing notification. He stared at the glowing screen in utter horror. Victoria had just ruthlessly filed an entirely fabricated emergency motion with the local county court. She maliciously claimed that DeAndre was a violent, unstable man actively attempting to kidnap her precious child across state lines. She was deliberately triggering an immediate and highly aggressive police manhunt for my son. She intended to have him viciously arrested before the sun could even rise to secure her total dominance. I slowly gripped the cold steering wheel. The silent adjustment had now officially started, and they had absolutely no idea what massive storm was rapidly approaching them right now today. The tires of my truck crushed the scattered shards of safety glass littering the pavement outside the commercial architectural studio of my son. We arrived just as the early morning sun breached the industrial skyline, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. A heavy commercial moving truck was backed directly over the concrete curb, its rear doors thrown wide open to accept the stolen cargo. Inside the expansive lobby, a private team of 6 men dressed in matching gray tactical utility vests were systematically dismantling the life my son had built. They swung heavy steel crowbars into the reinforced glass partitions of the drafting rooms. They ignored the expensive drafting tables and physical blueprints, marching straight toward the primary climate-controlled technology room at the back of the facility. DeAndre unbuckled his seatbelt before I even shifted the transmission into park. His breathing grew rapid and ragged. He watched in pure horror as 2 of the massive men began violently ripping the proprietary digital server racks straight out of the drywall. Sparks flew from severed thick black fiber optic cables. Those blinking black towers held every single original unedited contract and financial ledger related to his current commercial development projects. They held the exact unredacted digital copies, proving William completely fabricated the loan default that triggered this hostile seizure. DeAndre knew immediately that if those servers vanished into the back of that unmarked moving truck, his only definitive proof of absolute innocence would be permanently erased from existence. William had meticulously timed this aggressive physical raid to coincide perfectly with the false police manhunt. The billionaire wanted to ensure DeAndre was trapped inside a cold jail cell while his corporate mercenaries quietly wiped the digital slate totally clean. DeAndre threw the passenger door open and sprinted blindly toward the shattered entrance. DeAndre lunged toward the broken glass with blind fury, pushing his exhausted body to the absolute limit. He fully intended to physically fight every single one of those massive mercenaries to protect the architectural firm he had built from nothing. I moved faster than my age suggested. I stepped out of the truck and intercepted him before his boots could even touch the lobby tiles. I grabbed the back collar of his jacket with an unyielding iron grip and violently yanked him backward onto the sidewalk. He fought against my hold, completely overwhelmed by the crushing desperation of watching his entire livelihood being packed into a moving truck. I slammed him hard against the side of my Ford and ordered him to look closely at the tactical vests the men were wearing. I pointed a steady finger at the small, heavily embroidered corporate logo stitched directly over their left breast pockets. I calmly explained that those repo men did not work directly for his arrogant father-in-law. They belonged to a highly aggressive subsidiary debt collection agency owned entirely by a massive coastal banking conglomerate. William had intentionally hired a third-party corporate entity to execute this dirty task. I looked my son directly in the eyes and laid out the brutal legal reality of his situation. If DeAndre ran into that lobby and threw a single punch, he would be immediately arrested for aggravated felony assault against licensed corporate agents. I explained that an active assault charge would permanently validate the malicious lies his treacherous wife had just filed with the local family court. Fighting these men physically would guarantee that he lost permanent custody of little Nyla before the trial even started. This raid was not merely about seizing proprietary technology or destroying crucial evidence. It was an incredibly precise psychological trap designed to strip him of his fatherhood. William completely anticipated that the sheer emotional trauma of losing his business would force DeAndre into making a violent mistake. I tightened my grip on his shoulders and told him that loud men lose because they act on raw emotion. We were going to win because we operate with absolute cold discipline. I ordered him to stand down and let the men load the servers. He finally stopped struggling and nodded his head as bitter tears of frustration streamed down his exhausted face. He trusted my quiet resolve. I released his collar and calmly reached back into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I pulled out my secure burner phone and immediately dialed the direct encrypted line of Gavin Thorne. I completely bypassed the local police department, knowing they were thoroughly corrupted by the political influence of William. I spoke into the receiver with a soft, steady tone while watching the repo men load the server racks into their massive truck. I ordered Gavin to instantly execute a highly aggressive hostile buyout of the regional parent holding group that directly controlled the subsidiary debt collection agency. I authorized him to use the vast unlimited liquid capital currently resting inside my unlisted offshore corporate trust. I instructed him to make it an all-cash transaction, bypassing any standard board approval protocols to ensure absolute immediate transfer of primary ownership. The entire massive financial strike was completely invisible to the men grunting and sweating inside the shattered architectural studio. They continued loading the final pieces of stolen technology, assuming they were executing a flawless corporate raid for their wealthy employer. I simply leaned against the hood of my truck and watched the digital clock on my dashboard slowly tick forward. Within exactly 14 minutes, the heavy silence of the cold morning was suddenly broken by the shrill ringing of a cellular phone. The lead repo man wiped sweat from his thick brow and answered the call. I watched his highly aggressive posture completely evaporate into pure fear. He received a frantic, disorganized phone call straight from his terrified chief executive officer. The man listened in absolute stunned silence as he was abruptly informed that their entire national debt agency had just been aggressively purchased in a matter of mere minutes by a completely unknown, untouchable corporate ghost entity. The lead mercenary dropped his crowbar onto the shattered glass and barked an immediate order to his confused team. They were instructed to carefully put every single server rack back into the facility, sweep up the broken glass, repair the damaged doors, and leave the premises immediately. DeAndre stared at his father in absolute shock, unable to comprehend the staggering display of invisible power he had just witnessed. I turned to my son and finally revealed the hidden truth I had kept buried for decades. I calmly explained that I sold my highly classified commercial engineering patents 30 years ago for hundreds of millions of dollars. I deliberately hid the vast fortune in unlisted accounts simply to ensure DeAndre learned the genuine value of hard, exhausting work without the corrupting safety net of endless privilege. William thought he was ruthlessly crushing a poor, defenseless old man from a working-class neighborhood. He never realized he had just picked a devastating fight with a financial leviathan. He had awakened a sleeping giant who possessed the unlimited capital necessary to entirely obliterate his precious real estate empire. The ultimate corporate war for the survival of our bloodline had now officially begun today. The heavy glass doors of the architectural studio remained shattered, but the interior was finally quiet and perfectly secure. DeAndre immediately rushed toward the primary technology room and began reconnecting the thick black fiber optic cables to the salvaged server racks. The blinking blue lights of the hardware illuminated his exhausted face as the system slowly booted up. He sat at his main terminal and furiously typed in his administrative passwords. His hands moved with desperate precision across the keyboard. He needed to locate the original unedited development contract that William Stanford had maliciously altered to frame him for the massive commercial loan default. That single digital document was the absolute key to proving his innocence and exposing the fraudulent corporate trap. The screen flickered as the main drives initialized. DeAndre and I stood side by side in the freezing room staring at the massive monitors. He initiated a deep system search and began meticulously combing through tens of thousands of encrypted corporate emails and archived project files. The silence between us was heavy with anticipation. He cross-referenced dates and hidden financial attachments, searching for the specific metadata fingerprint of the authentic guarantee agreement he had signed 3 years ago. The server fans roared to life as the processor handled the massive data request. Every single folder they opened represented a piece of his stolen livelihood. He navigated through the dense digital architecture he had personally designed, hoping his complex internal security protocols had survived the violent physical assault. His eyes darted across endless lines of code and fragmented data packets. We watched the search bar crawl across the screen, indexing every hidden corner of the company network. He needed that specific original PDF document to completely destroy the false narrative his father-in-law had constructed against us. Suddenly, a blaring red warning notification flashed violently across the dual high-definition displays. The files were heavily corrupted. William Stanford had maliciously deployed an aggressive remote wipe protocol just seconds before the repo men initially breached the building. My son watched in absolute horror as the active recovery software displayed endless rows of degraded, unreadable data blocks. The precise architectural files he needed to legally clear his name were dissolving into meaningless digital static right in front of his eyes. DeAndre gripped the edge of the heavy desk so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He fell into a suffocatingly dark despair, believing the definitive proof of his absolute innocence was permanently erased from existence forever. The brutal reality of his situation crashed down on his exhausted shoulders. Without that specific original contract safely in his hands, DeAndre faced severe and immediate federal indictments for massive corporate embezzlement. This entirely fabricated narrative was perfectly constructed by his ruthless father-in-law to ensure DeAndre would be permanently locked away inside a federal penitentiary. William intended to completely strip my son of his freedom, his career, and his beloved daughter, all in one perfectly orchestrated financial attack. DeAndre buried his face deep into his hands and let out a broken, ragged breath. He had spent 10 grueling years building this prestigious commercial design firm from a single borrowed laptop. He had poured every ounce of his brilliant creative soul into creating a lasting legacy for little Nyla. Now all his monumental efforts were completely reduced to heavily fragmented error codes flashing across a cold screen. He felt completely defeated by the staggering wealth and endless corrupt influence of the Stanford family. The overwhelming stress of the impending federal charges paralyzed him completely. He believed the billionaire tycoon had truly achieved an absolute, flawless victory over his entire life. The terrifying shadow of a lengthy prison sentence loomed heavily over his broken spirit. He looked up at me with deeply hollow eyes, convinced that we had finally lost the war. The digital wipe had successfully eliminated every single trace of the treacherous financial crime William had maliciously committed. My son was now standing directly over an inescapable legal abyss, and he possessed absolutely no weapons left to fight back against the massive incoming storm today, which was deliberately orchestrated to violently destroy his very existence and legacy permanently, without any mercy. I did not share his desperate panic. I remained completely silent and perfectly calm as I reached down to the scuffed floorboards and picked up my heavy canvas tool bag. I placed it gently onto his drafting table and unzipped the main compartment. DeAndre watched me with immense confusion as I bypassed my wrenches and hammers to access a deeply concealed false bottom sewn securely into the thick fabric lining. I reached inside and extracted a pristine, thick, hard-copy financial ledger bound in black leather. I set it firmly onto the glass table directly in front of him. I finally explained that his arrogant father-in-law was completely predictable. I revealed that I had been secretly paying a highly specialized forensic accountant to aggressively audit the Stanford real estate firm for the past 12 months. While William assumed I was just a retired mechanic passing time, I was actually meticulously mapping his entire fraudulent banking structure. I opened the heavy ledger and turned past dozens of heavily annotated pages. I pulled out a perfectly preserved physical copy of the exact unredacted development contract William thought he had successfully destroyed. It contained the authentic, unaltered terms and the undeniable forged signature protocols proving absolutely that William committed massive felony wire fraud. I placed the pristine documents directly into the trembling hands of my son. He stared at the immaculate physical evidence with wide, deeply shocked eyes. The heavy, oppressive darkness in the room instantly evaporated completely. I gently placed my hand on his rigid shoulder and told him that quiet men always keep receipts. DeAndre realized the profound magnitude of my silent preparation. The digital wipe meant absolutely nothing because we now fully possessed the undeniable physical truth securely in our unyielding grip right here today without any question. Before we could safely deliver this definitive contract directly to the federal prosecutor, a sleek black chauffeured sedan suddenly pulled up outside the shattered glass doors. Diane Stanford stepped elegantly onto the broken pavement wearing an incredibly expensive designer coat. The wealthy mother-in-law moved with a cold, calculated arrogance that mirrored her corrupt husband perfectly. She walked straight into the studio, ignoring the massive destruction completely. She opened her pristine leather handbag and presented a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the glass drafting table. Inside were heavily doctored high-resolution photographs, maliciously fabricated to entirely destroy the professional career and personal character of DeAndre. Diane looked at me with venomous, elite condescension, threatening to release these completely ruinous images to the global press immediately, unless I handed over the original unredacted contract. She truly believed her immense societal privilege granted her the ultimate power to blackmail us into absolute submission. She thought the overwhelming fear of public humiliation would instantly break our resolve and force us to surrender. Diane smiled, assuming she had just cornered us perfectly, but she possessed absolutely no idea what devastating financial secrets I had personally acquired to instantly neutralize her permanently today. Diane Stanford walked into the shattered commercial architectural studio with the cold entitlement of a woman who believed the world existed entirely to serve her. She carefully navigated around the broken glass in her pristine designer heels and stopped directly in front of the drafting table. She did not acknowledge the sheer destruction her husband had orchestrated just an hour prior. She simply opened her expensive leather handbag and extracted a thick manila folder. Diane dropped the folder onto the smooth glass surface right next to the authentic, unredacted contract we had just recovered. She looked at me with a polite and deeply venomous elitism. She stated that her powerful family held absolute control over the local and state media narratives. She flipped the folder open with a manicured finger to reveal a series of highly disturbing images. The high-resolution photographs were heavily doctored but incredibly convincing. They maliciously depicted my son DeAndre in manufactured situations of severe domestic aggression and violent instability. Diane smiled a freezing and calculated smile. She explained that she had paid a highly specialized digital manipulation firm to fabricate these career-destroying images, specifically as an insurance policy. She looked directly into the exhausted eyes of my son and demanded the immediate total destruction of the authentic loan contract resting on the table. She offered a remarkably simple and brutal ultimatum. If we surrendered the physical ledger and walked away quietly from the architectural firm, she would permanently bury the fabricated photographs. If we refused, she promised to release the images to every major news outlet and social media platform before noon. She spoke with the absolute certainty of an elite aristocrat who had never faced a single genuine consequence in her entire pampered and incredibly sheltered life up until this very specific moment. Diane continued her vicious psychological assault with a perfectly measured and quiet tone. She detailed exactly how the media conglomerates would eagerly portray DeAndre. She promised to frame him as an unstable and violently aggressive African-American man who buckled under the immense pressure of corporate leadership. She weaponized his race and his background, threatening to feed the most destructive societal stereotypes directly to the hungry public. She guaranteed that once the doctored images began circulating online, the narrative would become permanent and entirely irreversible. She looked around the damaged studio and assured him that no respectable commercial client would ever hire him to design a building again. His professional reputation would be systematically eradicated. He would become an absolute pariah in the architectural industry, completely unable to secure even the most basic employment anywhere. The immense weight of her calculated threats slammed into DeAndre like a physical blow. His breathing became shallow and erratic. His severe anxiety spiked violently as he stared down at the terrifyingly realistic fabricated images of his own face contorted into rage. He felt the terrifying shadow of complete societal ruin closing in around him. He thought of his sweet daughter Nyla, and the profound shame these false images would bring to her life as she grew older. The sheer terror of public humiliation paralyzed his rational judgment. He firmly believed Diane possessed the unlimited resources necessary to execute this devastating character assassination flawlessly. DeAndre turned toward me with deep desperation radiating from his exhausted eyes. He placed his trembling hand over the pristine, unredacted contract we had fought so hard to secure. He urged me to immediately surrender the physical ledger to his malicious mother-in-law. He pleaded with me to choose the preservation of our clean family name over the recovery of his stolen business. He argued that no amount of financial justice was worth the permanent destruction of his personal dignity and the future safety of his little girl. He was entirely ready to accept total defeat and walk away from 10 years of grueling architectural labor just to appease the relentless extortion of the Stanford family. Diane crossed her arms and patiently waited for our total submissive compliance. She felt completely certain that her horrific blackmail had utterly broken the proud spirit of my son. She believed she had effectively neutralized any threat of our retaliation forever perfectly without fail. I did not flinch or react to her disgusting theatrical display. I slowly unscrewed the metal cap of my worn steel thermos and poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee, completely unbothered by her elite posturing. Diane narrowed her eyes in profound irritation, expecting me to cower in fear just like my son had done. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark liquid, letting the tense silence stretch across the cold room. I gently set the metal cup down on the edge of the drafting table. I reached deeply into the inner chest pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a completely different financial dossier bound in thick blue cardboard. I slid the heavy document directly across the smooth glass table until it came to a permanent stop right over her fabricated photographs. I looked the wealthy mother-in-law straight in the eyes and calmly informed her that quiet men audit everything. I explained that my forensic accountant did not just investigate the commercial real estate operations of her husband. We had meticulously audited the primary financial ledgers of the Stanford Family Corporate Charity Foundation. I told her that the thick blue dossier contained absolute, irrefutable proof that she had been secretly embezzling millions of philanthropic dollars for over 7 years. The meticulous banking records clearly demonstrated how she aggressively funneled those stolen charitable donations directly into her own secret unlisted offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands to fund her lavish hidden lifestyle. The color completely and instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her arrogant posture shattered immediately as she stared down at the undeniable documented proof of her own massive felony financial crimes resting right under her trembling manicured hands, right here, very clearly in front of us all today. I took another slow sip of my hot coffee and calmly informed Diane that the physical folder resting on the table was merely a duplicate copy. I told her that my brilliant corporate attorney Gavin Thorne had already forwarded the entire digital embezzlement dossier directly to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division exactly 1 hour ago. I explained that federal agents were actively preparing to freeze her fraudulent accounts and issue an immediate warrant for her arrest. Diane physically recoiled from the drafting table as if the heavy blue folder had suddenly caught fire. The vicious, predatory woman who had just gleefully threatened to systematically destroy the life of my son suddenly found herself facing decades inside a federal penitentiary. She turned around and fled the shattered architectural studio in sheer absolute terror, stumbling clumsily in her expensive designer heels. She threw herself into the back of her chauffeured sedan and immediately dialed William. She shrieked hysterically into her cell phone, informing the arrogant tycoon that their massive financial crimes had been completely exposed. Her panicked phone call caused William to initiate a desperate emergency transfer of his core liquid assets straight to the Cayman Islands immediately without any delay today. High above the city, inside the sprawling glass and steel penthouse office of his corporate headquarters, William Stanford was completely losing his mind. The pristine mahogany desk was covered in scattered financial ledgers and his own trembling hands. He had just received the frantic, deeply hysterical phone call from his terrified wife, Diane. He knew instantly that his massive criminal empire was collapsing rapidly around him. William did not possess the courage to stay and fight the federal government. He operated purely on cowardly greed. He threw himself into his high-backed leather chair and aggressively typed his master administrative credentials into the primary executive computer terminal. His breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing loudly in the completely empty boardroom. He immediately accessed the core operational accounts of his massive real estate conglomerate. He rapidly initiated a massive emergency offshore transfer. He was desperately attempting to wire $80 million of liquid corporate capital directly to a heavily encrypted, untraceable banking account located safely in the Cayman Islands. He intended to completely drain his own company dry and abandon his entire workforce before the federal authorities could secure the building. He watched the digital progress bar initialize on the bright, glowing monitor. He felt a brief surge of arrogant triumph, believing he could simply purchase his way out of this monumental disaster just as he had always done. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and waited for the final confirmation screen to appear. He assumed his vast wealth made him entirely untouchable by the law and beyond the reach of any consequence. He stared at the screen, completely convinced his final cowardly escape was totally secured. He thought he had effortlessly outsmarted everyone, including the quiet man from the working-class neighborhood. The computer screen suddenly flashed a stark and blindingly bright red error code directly across the entire center of the massive display monitor. The $80 million transaction was instantly and permanently blocked. The digital prompt demanded absolute executive authorization, but completely rejected his personal security override parameters. William violently slammed his heavy fists onto the mahogany desk, shattering a crystal glass onto the carpeted floor. He snatched his gold-plated desk phone and furiously dialed his elite banking liaisons at the primary coastal financial institution. He screamed directly into the receiver with a completely unhinged volume, demanding an immediate manual override of the blocked offshore wire transfer. He threatened to entirely liquidate his massive corporate accounts and destroy their prestigious banking firm if they did not instantly execute his command. The senior bank manager on the other end of the line did not cower or apologize. The banker spoke with the profoundly cold and detached professional tone, informing the enraged tycoon that his hands were completely tied. The manager explicitly stated that a very powerful federal judge had officially placed a total hard freeze on every single corporate and personal account linked to the Stanford name. William felt the blood completely drain from his face as he listened to the terrifying explanation. While William was aggressively throwing my son onto the street and maliciously ordering the physical destruction of the commercial studio servers, I had already effectively deployed my countermeasure. My brilliant attorney Gavin Thorne had personally carried the pristine, unredacted contract we salvaged from the studio directly to the federal prosecutor before the sun had fully risen. That single, unaltered document undeniably proved William had maliciously committed massive felony wire fraud to orchestrate the architectural loan default. Gavin successfully utilized that pristine physical evidence to instantly secure an emergency federal injunction against the Stanford real estate empire. The legal maneuver was executed with absolutely flawless precision and terrifying speed. The impenetrable financial wall William had spent his entire life building was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He was now permanently locked out of his own massive fortune. The invincible shield of extreme wealth he always relied upon to avoid justice was entirely shattered into pieces today. He was totally and completely trapped inside his incredibly lavish penthouse office without any viable or realistic exit strategy ever remaining to successfully save his rapidly collapsing corrupt legacy. William hung up the gold-plated desk phone and stared blankly at the dark screen of his computer monitor, entirely paralyzed by the sudden devastating reality of his new existence. He slowly realized that his entire massive financial empire was now completely and irrevocably frozen. Without any access to his primary liquid capital, he absolutely could not pay his thousands of commercial contractors. He could not cover the exorbitant retainer fees for his aggressive corporate lawyers. He could not even process the basic weekly payroll for the heavily armed private security teams currently guarding his numerous residential estates. The invincible, arrogant tycoon was suddenly effectively bankrupt in the span of a single morning. The profound silence of the penthouse office pressed down on him like a physical weight, suffocating his immense pride. For decades, he had mercilessly destroyed the honest lives of hard-working people like my son without ever facing a single consequence. He believed his vast money entirely insulated him from the laws of ordinary men. Now he was experiencing the absolute terror of total financial vulnerability for the very first time. His deep-seated arrogance instantly evaporated, twisting violently into a blinding and chaotic panic. He stumbled backward away from the massive mahogany desk, knocking over a heavy bronze sculpture. He gasped for air, feeling the invisible walls of the federal indictment rapidly closing in around him. He desperately needed untraceable hard cash to safely escape the country before the authorities arrived. But every single avenue was perfectly blocked by my unyielding legal maneuvering. The man who had viciously kicked my son out into the freezing morning mist was now the one left completely exposed and entirely defenseless. He finally understood the truly devastating caliber of the quiet man he had foolishly chosen to cross right here today. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Stanford was actively browsing the racks of an incredibly exclusive luxury boutique. She casually handed her black titanium credit card to the nervous cashier to purchase a heavily overpriced designer handbag. The digital payment terminal beeped loudly, rejecting the transaction entirely. The cashier awkwardly informed Victoria that every single card tied to her name was actively declining. Victoria snatched her phone and checked her mobile banking application, discovering that her limitless trust fund was completely locked. The horrifying realization hit her instantly. Her arrogant father had suddenly lost all his immense wealth. Her entire perfectly sheltered existence had just vanished into thin air. Without a single dollar to her name, she desperately sprinted out of the store and drove her sports car directly back to the architectural studio. She aggressively burst through the shattered glass doors with mascara running down her pale cheeks. Victoria dropped forcefully to her knees onto the hard floor directly in front of DeAndre. She began weeping hysterically and begging him for total forgiveness. She looked up at her husband with desperate eyes, maliciously claiming she was nothing more than an innocent, helpless victim of her father and his ruthless manipulation today. Victoria Stanford dropped forcefully to her knees onto the hard floor directly in front of DeAndre inside the shattered architectural studio. She immediately initiated a flawless display of calculated victimhood. Her makeup was perfectly smeared down her pale cheeks to simulate profound trauma. She reached out and desperately grasped the trembling hands of my son. She began weeping profusely, echoing loud, agonizing sobs throughout the empty lobby. She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, completely ignoring my presence in the room. Victoria maliciously claimed she was nothing more than an innocent, helpless victim of her father and his ruthless financial manipulation. She insisted William had forced her to participate in the cruel eviction under severe threats of total disinheritance. She pleaded with DeAndre to believe that she never actually wanted to separate him from little Nyla. The entitled daughter of the billionaire tycoon then presented her ultimate desperate proposition. She offered to serve as a primary witness and voluntarily testify against William Stanford in federal court. She promised to provide the prosecutors with every hidden detail of his illegal offshore banking operations. In exchange for this testimony, she demanded exactly half of the newly restored architectural business and a full legal reconciliation of their marriage. She framed her extortion as a romantic sacrifice, suggesting they could rebuild their lives together on the ashes of her father and his corrupt empire. She squeezed his hands tighter and begged him to bring their family back together today. DeAndre stared down at the weeping woman, entirely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming barrage of emotional manipulation. The sudden shift from a treacherous enemy to a pleading victim completely disoriented his exhausted mind. He stood completely frozen, unable to form a single coherent response to her desperate, treacherous plea for mercy right now. DeAndre faced the ultimate psychological conflict standing in the ruins of his own commercial studio. He stared intently at the weeping woman he had loved completely for over a decade. Her hot tears falling onto his knuckles looked incredibly genuine to his exhausted mind. Victoria weaponized their shared history with lethal precision. She deliberately invoked deeply intimate memories of their early relationship when they were just two young students building a life together far away from her father and his towering wealth. She softly whispered the exact pet names she used when Nyla was born, desperately trying to break down the heavy emotional walls DeAndre had erected to protect himself. The calculated nostalgia struck him directly in the chest. A profound and agonizing hesitation washed over my son. He remembered the fierce promises they made to each other at the altar. The lingering, deep-seated attachment to his wife violently clashed with the brutal, terrifying reality of her recent betrayal. He looked at her trembling shoulders and genuinely considered accepting her treacherous deal. The overwhelming desire to permanently reunite his precious daughter with her mother clouded his usually sharp, rational judgment. He desperately wanted to believe that William was the sole architect of their misery, and that Victoria was merely a pawn trapped in a rich man's cruel game. He thought about the immense strategic advantage her testimony would provide against the Stanford Empire in federal court. Having the daughter of the tycoon publicly detail the offshore fraud would guarantee a permanent, effortless victory without requiring a drawn-out legal war. The temptation to simply end the conflict and repair his shattered family unit was incredibly powerful. He imagined bringing Victoria back into their home and pretending the horrific morning eviction never actually happened. The emotional poison of the Stanford family was actively attempting to reinfect his life through the incredibly convincing performance of a desperate woman. DeAndre felt his rigid spine begin to soften under the heavy weight of her manufactured tears. He closed his eyes and inhaled a sharp, ragged breath, fighting a massive internal war between his broken heart and his clear, logical mind. He slowly opened his mouth and looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling on the shattered glass floor, preparing to offer her the very unconditional forgiveness she absolutely did not ever deserve to receive from him under any possible circumstances today, right now. DeAndre stopped speaking and looked up directly into my eyes across the destroyed commercial studio. I remained completely silent, sitting on a heavy stool near the broken doorway. I offered no verbal guidance and absolutely no emotional direction for my son. I simply watched him with a steady, unyielding gaze, forcing him to forge his own unbreakable spine in this critical moment. DeAndre needed to learn how to sever a diseased limb to save the healthy body. He stared at my calm posture, and the utter clarity of my silent resolve instantly pierced through his thick fog of emotional manipulation. The intense psychological spell Victoria had cast over him shattered into a million useless pieces. He suddenly realized the profound, brutal truth of her incredibly sudden return. Victoria only crawled back to this studio because her black titanium credit cards violently stopped working at her luxury boutiques. She did not miss her husband, and she certainly did not miss her daughter. She merely missed the endless security of extreme wealth that she assumed DeAndre was about to legally inherit from my unlisted offshore trust. DeAndre channeled my quiet, formidable power and physically stepped back away from her trembling grasp. He let her manicured hands fall completely flat onto the dirty concrete floor. He stood incredibly tall, adjusting his jacket with absolute and entirely cold detachment. He completely rejected her incredibly treacherous offer with a perfectly steady and commanding voice. He told the desperately weeping woman that she was now absolutely nothing more than a complete and total stranger to his entire family bloodline. He ordered Victoria to leave his commercial property immediately and never return to his life under any circumstances forever. The absolute finality of his severe rejection echoed perfectly across the entire room, cementing his total independence today. The desperate tears streaming down the face of Victoria Stanford vanished instantly, replaced by an incredibly chilling and entirely vindictive rage. Her innocent facade dissolved completely, revealing the vicious entitlement underneath. She stood up from the floor and aggressively pulled a thick legal document directly from her expensive designer purse. She held the stamped paper up high and grinned with pure malice. Victoria revealed that exactly 2 hours before our federal injunction froze the corporate accounts, she had successfully executed one final malicious financial maneuver. She had legally and officially placed an aggressive commercial construction lien directly on the sacred land where my childhood church still stands. She intended to forcibly seize the highly coveted community property and bulldoze the entire historic religious site to construct a massive, profitable strip mall by tomorrow morning. The vindictive daughter believed she had finally discovered the ultimate leverage necessary to destroy my stoic composure and force DeAndre to surrender the architectural firm. She completely miscalculated the profound depth of my silent retaliation because my own legal maneuvering had already targeted the very roof over her entitled head, making her entire extortion attempt entirely worthless right now at this exact moment in time today. The cold marble floors of the municipal city zoning office echoed with the sharp footsteps of my son and I as we pushed through the heavy oak doors the very next morning. We arrived exactly as the administrative building opened for public business. Standing directly in front of the primary zoning commissioner's elevated mahogany desk was Victoria Stanford, surrounded by a phalanx of her father's high-priced corporate attorneys. They wore immaculate tailored suits and carried themselves with the same manufactured arrogance that infected their wealthy employers. The lead attorney was actively presenting the aggressive construction lien to the weary civil servant, demanding immediate executive authorization to commence the total demolition of my childhood church. Victoria stood perfectly straight beside him, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable privilege. She had clearly recovered from her pathetic weeping display at the studio and fully embraced her vindictive nature. She wanted to hurt me in the most profound and permanent way possible simply because my son had finally refused to bow to her manipulation. The legal documents resting on the commissioner's desk represented the complete erasure of a historic community cornerstone. The lawyers spoke with rapid, calculated precision, citing obscure municipal development statutes and overwhelming the official with dense legal jargon designed to force a rapid approval. They deliberately intended to secure the final physical destruction order before we could even mount a basic legal defense. Victoria turned her head and noticed us walking down the central aisle. She offered a remarkably cold and triumphant smile, completely convinced that her aggressive preemptive strike was absolutely unstoppable. She truly believed that her immense financial resources and inherited corporate power would effortlessly bulldoze both the sacred religious sanctuary and our stubborn family pride directly into the dirt today, without any resistance whatsoever right now, immediately. The zoning commissioner sat heavily in his oversized leather chair, deeply influenced by the massive political donations William Stanford had consistently funneled into his re-election campaigns over the past decade. He barely skimmed the legal documents before reaching for the heavy rubber stamp resting on his desk, perfectly prepared to authorize the immediate demolition order without a single second thought. DeAndre quickly stepped forward and firmly placed his hands on the polished edge of the desk, desperately attempting to halt the corrupt administrative process. My son passionately argued the profound cultural significance of the brick building, pleading with the commissioner to recognize its irreplaceable historical value to our local working-class neighborhood. He explained that generations of families had worshipped and sought sanctuary within those specific sacred walls, long before the Stanford corporate conglomerate began aggressively purchasing the surrounding municipal blocks for commercial redevelopment. DeAndre begged the weary civil servant to temporarily delay the lethal authorization pending a formal architectural review to evaluate the structural integrity and heritage status of the church. The commissioner sighed impatiently and entirely dismissed his emotional pleas with a wave of his hand. He coldly stated that the local municipality did not care about sentimental attachments or neighborhood nostalgia. He brutally clarified that the law only recognizes registered capital and proper documentation, indicating that the aggressively acquired construction lien presented by the Stanford attorneys was entirely legally binding. Victoria watched the devastating exchange from the side of the desk and smirked with pure, unadulterated malice. She thoroughly enjoyed watching my son struggle uselessly against the massive bureaucratic machine her father essentially owned. She firmly believed she had successfully discovered the absolute perfect method to hurt me in the deepest and most painful way possible, striking directly at the core of my childhood memories and spiritual foundation. She crossed her arms confidently, assuming her vindictive retaliation was currently an entirely finalized conclusion. The heavy rubber stamp hovered menacingly over the finalized paperwork, ready to permanently erase a vital piece of my personal history. The elite lawyers stood silently by, radiating intense satisfaction as they anticipated their massive administrative victory. My son looked back at me with incredible frustration burning in his tired eyes, believing the corrupt municipal system had successfully defeated us once again. Victoria simply chuckled softly, savoring her vicious triumph as the official pressed the inked stamp downward forcefully toward the clean, pristine page. Before the black ink could permanently stain the white authorization paper, Gavin Thorne suddenly stepped briskly up to the wooden commissioner's desk. The razor-sharp attorney confidently bypassed the entire group of extremely highly paid corporate lawyers without breaking his intense professional stride. Gavin firmly slapped a thick stack of freshly stamped banking records directly over the demolition documents, entirely blocking the descent of the rubber stamp. He aggressively instructed the corrupt civil servant to meticulously review the certified origin of the financial capital utilized to initially purchase the contested construction lien. Gavin loudly articulated that the official records provided absolute, irrefutable proof that the Stanford real estate firm had intentionally used illegally acquired and directly embezzled corporate funds to secure the land. He completely devastated their entire legal argument by coldly reminding the commissioner about a very specific and unyielding federal statute regarding financial fraud. By absolute federal law, any municipal property action aggressively taken using illicit or stolen funds is immediately rendered totally void, and the associated land is instantly seized by the state government indefinitely. The commissioner physically recoiled from his desk, rapidly dropping the heavy rubber stamp as if it had suddenly caught fire. The terrified official realized that authorizing the destruction of the historic church, utilizing demonstrably embezzled corporate capital, would instantly guarantee his own immediate federal indictment and total career ruin. Sweating profusely under the intense legal scrutiny of my attorney, the terrified civil servant was forcefully compelled to physically tear the official demolition order into tiny, unrecognizable pieces right in front of everyone. The elite Stanford lawyers stood completely paralyzed in absolute stunned silence, totally unable to counter the flawless federal trap Gavin had perfectly orchestrated to legally protect my sacred community cornerstone forever, right here and today, perfectly securely right now, immediately. Gavin Thorne definitely did not permanently stop his aggressive legal counterattack there at the local zoning desk. He coldly turned toward the stunned billionaire daughter and firmly handed Victoria an entirely separate thick stack of pristine legal papers. I calmly stepped forward and quietly revealed that I had just personally purchased the massive defaulting commercial debt on William Stanford's very own primary residential estate. Victoria stared down at the documents with absolute sheer horror flooding her pale, trembling face, completely shattering her immense pride instantly. The luxurious multi-million-dollar Stanford mansion was now officially locked in active brutal foreclosure proceedings, and the aggressive physical eviction process officially begins right now today without any mercy whatsoever. The very same arrogant family who had mercilessly ordered my son to be viciously thrown out onto the freezing street just yesterday morning was now abruptly losing the exact golden roof over their own completely entitled heads. Victoria dropped the heavy foreclosure documents onto the marble floor, her ultimate vindictive plot totally ruined forever and completely destroyed. She finally realized my quiet wrath was utterly inescapable and entirely absolute, ensuring our family survived their incredible treachery permanently without fail right here and now today. William and his frantic daughter Victoria sped their sleek silver sports car violently through the exclusive residential streets of their gated community. The tires screeched against the pristine black asphalt as Victoria slammed the brakes directly in front of the towering wrought iron gates of their sprawling suburban mansion. The sheer panic consuming their minds instantly froze into absolute dread. Two heavily armed county sheriffs were already standing calmly beside the towering stone pillars, marking the grand entrance of the primary Stanford estate. The officers were methodically affixing bright red official foreclosure notices directly onto the immaculate masonry. The heavy federal tape secured the eviction orders with undeniable finality. William threw his car door open and stumbled onto the manicured grass, completely unable to process the visceral sight of his own permanent ruin. The bright red paper contrasted sharply against the elegant gray stone, declaring to the entire wealthy neighborhood that the invincible Stanford financial empire was completely dead. Victoria gripped the leather steering wheel with trembling hands, watching the law enforcement officers systematically seal the perimeter of the only home she had ever known. The massive multi-million-dollar estate was no longer their personal playground. It now belonged entirely to the quiet working-class man they had foolishly attempted to destroy. The sheriffs operated with absolute cold efficiency, ignoring the expensive vehicles and the prestigious address entirely. They secured the heavy iron gates shut with a thick industrial steel chain and a heavy brass padlock, loudly locking the billionaire out of his own fortress. William stared at the heavy chain with wide, terrified eyes. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic as the absolute reality of his complete financial obliteration finally crashed down upon his heavy shoulders right here today permanently without any mercy left for him. William suffered a complete and total narcissistic collapse right on the manicured lawn of his seized property. He fundamentally could not fathom that a quiet, retired African-American man driving an old Ford truck had flawlessly outmaneuvered his entire billion-dollar legacy. His fragile ego violently shattered into jagged pieces as the profound humiliation burned through his veins. For 40 years, he had effortlessly crushed ordinary citizens beneath his expensive boots without ever facing a single consequence. He truly believed his massive wealth elevated him above the fundamental laws of society. Now he was standing entirely powerless outside the very gates he had built to keep the working class away. The terrifying reality of his absolute defeat triggered a volatile and dangerous psychological breakdown. William aggressively lunged toward the iron perimeter, screaming viciously at the calm county sheriffs with a completely unhinged volume. He arrogantly claimed that he personally owned the entire city infrastructure and directly funded their municipal salaries. He demanded they immediately remove the federal foreclosure notices, threatening to systematically destroy their humble careers and bankrupt their families if they dared to defy his elite commands. The uniformed officers completely ignored his frantic wealthy tantrums, maintaining their stoic professional composure as they continued documenting the property seizure. The distinct lack of total submissive obedience from the public servants pushed the corrupt billionaire straight over the mental edge. William entirely lost control of his basic rational faculties. His face turned bright purple with suffocating fury as he blindly charged forward. In a fit of pure, reckless, elitist rage, he raised his trembling hands and physically shoved one of the heavily armed officers directly in the center of his protective vest. He desperately tried to rip the bright red eviction document straight off the elegant stone pillar, violently screaming that his private residential sanctuary was completely untouchable. He foolishly assumed the badge-wearing men would simply absorb his violent physical assault without retaliation because of his immense corporate stature. William forgot that extreme capital no longer shielded his aggressive actions, and this single arrogant, violent mistake instantly transformed his massive civil financial ruin into a severe state criminal offense, sealing his incredibly dark permanent fate right here on the very street he once proudly dominated without any hesitation or mercy. Today, in the bright morning sunlight, permanently securing his utter complete social destruction, completely forever without question, perfectly securely now. The heavily armed sheriff reacted instantly to the aggressive, unprovoked physical assault without a single ounce of hesitation. He aggressively grabbed the expensive lapels of William Stanford and violently tackled the furious billionaire directly onto the hard concrete pavement. The breathtaking illusion of the untouchable corporate elite was entirely shattered on the cold, abrasive driveway. William gasped for air as his cheek was pressed roughly against the dirty ground. The officer swiftly wrenched the tycoon arms forcefully behind his back and clamped heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. He loudly read William his Miranda rights, officially arresting him for committing aggravated felony assault against an active law enforcement officer. The once invincible real estate mogul was instantly reduced to a common criminal groveling pathetically in the dirt. Victoria stood paralyzed beside her sleek sports car, watching the brutal subjugation of her incredibly powerful father in sheer absolute horror. She covered her trembling mouth as hot tears of pure terror streamed freely down her pale cheeks. The officers hauled the disgraced billionaire up from the pavement, entirely ignoring his continued frantic threats of massive lawsuits. They physically shoved the struggling tycoon roughly into the dark back seat of their waiting police squad car, slamming the heavy door shut with deafening authority. Victoria realized her father could no longer protect her from the devastating consequences of their boundless cruelty. His staggering wealth was entirely frozen, and his physical freedom was now completely revoked. The impenetrable Stanford dynasty was finally and completely dead forever, ensuring our absolute total victory without any mercy. Right here today, permanently, securely ending their incredibly long, dark reign of absolute corporate terror completely, perfectly, flawlessly right now, forever securing our incredible, absolute, unyielding family triumph, forever without fail, completely, flawlessly, securely now ending the corrupt dynasty today. The second armed sheriff approached the petrified billionaire daughter with absolute, uncompromising authority. He coldly informed Victoria that she possessed exactly 1 single hour to frantically pack her personal belongings and permanently vacate the seized premises. Victoria stared blankly at the massive padlocked gates, entirely shattered by her new destitute reality. With absolutely no money remaining in her frozen accounts, no luxurious home to provide shelter, and absolutely no powerful family left to rely upon for survival, she snapped. Her mind spiraled into a deeply dark, vindictive corner, realizing she desperately needed immediate leverage to force DeAndre into absolute submission. Victoria made a frantic, entirely dangerous decision to violently reclaim her lost dominance. She climbed into her sports car and violently reversed, completely ignoring the police cruisers. The desperate, unhinged woman accelerated aggressively down the suburban street, heading straight toward the local daycare center, intending to unlawfully seize little Nyla right now. She intended to physically kidnap her own innocent daughter, utilizing the terrified child as the ultimate vicious hostage, perfectly ensuring her own malicious survival today without any hesitation, perfectly flawlessly destroying our peace forever, starting an entirely new, incredible war, completely, securely, and totally immediately right now today. Victoria slammed her luxury sports car onto the pristine curb outside the prestigious Early Childhood Academy and sprinted toward the entrance. She burst through the heavy glass doors of the high-end daycare facility with wild, desperate eyes and disheveled hair. Her expensive designer heels clicked frantically against the polished hardwood floor as she rushed directly toward the pristine reception desk. A young administrative attendant looked up in sudden alarm as the frantic billionaire daughter slammed her hands onto the polished granite counter. Victoria immediately launched into a flawless display of manufactured hysteria, perfectly calculated to manipulate the inexperienced staff member. She breathlessly claimed that a catastrophic family emergency had just occurred involving her father. She forcefully insisted that she needed to withdraw her daughter Nyla from the facility right this very second. She loudly announced her immediate intention to take the child across state lines to be with her critically ill grandfather. The young receptionist blinked in sheer confusion and reflexively reached for the standard security checkout protocols. Victoria did not allow the frightened woman a single second to process the chaotic situation or review the authorized pickup registry. She aggressively leaned over the high counter and weaponized her prestigious family name to demand absolute instant compliance. She spoke with a venomous aristocratic authority, warning the trembling employee that any delay would result in massive corporate lawsuits. She demanded the immediate release of her child, stating that the Stanford family did not wait for bureaucratic permission slips during a severe medical crisis. Victoria projected the exact, terrifying entitlement of a wealthy woman who was entirely accustomed to destroying the lives of lower-class workers simply because they hesitated to obey her commands. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs as she prepared to forcefully bypass the secure entry gate. The terrified young attendant hesitated visibly, her hands shaking violently over the computer keyboard. She quietly stammered that standard facility protocols absolutely mandated visual verification of identification before unlocking the primary magnetic safety gate. Victoria sneered with unfiltered elitist disgust, realizing her forceful verbal intimidation was failing to produce immediate physical results. She refused to endure another single second of resistance from an hourly wage earner. She forcefully shoved the heavy metallic turnstile, utilizing her entire body weight to completely bypass the secure entry point. The loud security alarm instantly buzzed across the quiet lobby, but she completely ignored the blaring noise. Victoria marched aggressively down the brightly colored hallway, displaying pure, relentless determination. Her dark mind spiraled into a truly vicious and entirely unhinged criminal conspiracy. She held absolutely no genuine maternal desire to protect or comfort little Nyla during this incredibly chaotic morning. Her sole intention was to forcefully kidnap her own innocent daughter right out of the building. She intended to mercilessly weaponize the terrified child, utilizing her as the ultimate emotional bargaining chip to aggressively extort my hidden offshore fortune. She realized that acquiring direct physical possession of the child was her only remaining realistic strategy to reclaim her lost elite status. Victoria planned to demand tens of millions of dollars in untraceable liquid capital from my private trust in exchange for the safe return of my granddaughter. She calculated that DeAndre would instantly surrender his entire restored commercial architectural firm and every single recovered financial asset to ensure the total safety of his beloved child. She felt a sick, twisted sense of brilliant triumph, believing her ruthless maternal extortion plot was completely flawless and entirely unstoppable. She rounded the final corner of the primary developmental wing, completely deaf to the frantic footsteps of the chasing facility administrator echoing loudly down the hallway behind her. She approached the brightly painted wooden door of the preschool classroom, entirely convinced she was about to secure absolute financial dominance over my entire family bloodline. She aggressively reached her manicured hand toward the polished brass doorknob, fully preparing to violently snatch the toddler away from her innocent morning play and initiate a truly devastating interstate kidnapping operation. Immediately today, without any single hesitation whatsoever, right now, perfectly and absolutely securing her dark escape flawlessly, forever starting her brutal victory march today, permanently moving completely forward, entirely unbothered, and deeply malicious. Before her fingers could even touch the cold brass hardware, my calm voice completely shattered her arrogant delusion. Victoria violently recoiled and spun around, dropping her expensive handbag onto the tiled floor in sheer panic. I was already sitting perfectly still in a small folding chair positioned directly beside the classroom door, casually unscrewing the steel cap of my heavy work thermos. I poured a steaming cup of dark black coffee, entirely unbothered by her frantic arrival. I explained that I had thoroughly anticipated her exact narcissistic psychological profile the very second her father was arrested. I knew her overwhelming entitlement would instantly drive her to weaponize my granddaughter, so I drove my Ford truck here and comfortably beat her to the facility by an entire hour. I set my metal cup down and pulled a thick, perfectly pressed legal document from my canvas jacket. I calmly extended the finalized absolute divorce decree directly toward her trembling hands. I coldly articulated that the binding paperwork officially granted DeAndre full, unshared, permanent legal and physical custody of Nyla, stripping Victoria of all parental rights forever. I looked deeply into her terrified eyes and offered the broken billionaire a remarkably simple, devastating choice. She could either immediately sign the binding federal papers relinquishing her child and walk away from our family permanently, or I would instantly summon the armed police officers waiting outside the building to arrest her for committing severe felony attempted child kidnapping. I informed her that the state penitentiary would gladly welcome the spoiled daughter of a disgraced corporate fraud. The profound, undeniable reality of my flawless trap completely suffocated her vindictive spirit. Victoria realized she was entirely trapped without any wealth, power, or influence left to aggressively shield her from brutal absolute justice right here today, without fail. Victoria snatched the black ink pen and hastily scribbled her jagged signature across the finalized divorce decree with violently trembling hands. She surrendered every single legal right to her only daughter without expressing a single ounce of genuine maternal hesitation. She turned around and sprinted frantically out of the preschool building, forever leaving our bloodline entirely untouched by her toxic greed. I calmly opened the wooden classroom door and secured my precious granddaughter, lifting little Nyla safely into my strong arms to carry her entirely far away from the Stanford madness. We had finally won the incredibly exhausting legal battle to preserve our beautiful family intact. However, across the city, Diane Stanford was rapidly descending into pure, unadulterated madness. The disgraced elite matriarch had just learned about her husband rotting inside a cold jail cell and her cowardly daughter failing the kidnapping plot miserably. Stripped of her immense offshore wealth and suffocating under intense federal IRS scrutiny, Diane decided to orchestrate one final violently destructive revenge against my tangible physical assets. The unhinged billionaire wife contacted a brutal underground arsonist preparing to completely burn my precious historic automotive garage straight into the filthy ground before the sun rises tomorrow morning. Driven entirely by a blinding and irrational vengeance, Diane Stanford retreated to the shadowy corners of the internet to execute her final desperate strike. Stripped of her immense liquid wealth and facing severe federal scrutiny, she utilized an encrypted digital network to locate a ruthless unlisted contractor. She possessed absolutely no traceable cash to fund this highly illegal operation, so she ruthlessly liquidated her final remaining physical assets. Diane met the dangerous arsonist in the dimly lit subterranean parking garage of her luxury hotel, handing him a heavy velvet pouch filled with incredibly rare heirloom diamonds. She explicitly instructed the violent mercenary to completely incinerate my primary industrial warehouse before the morning sun could rise. Diane operated under the deeply flawed assumption that this specific, heavily fortified brick building currently housed my entire irreplaceable collection of classic restored automobiles. She firmly believed the vast facility also contained the pristine original blueprints and absolute physical archives of my highly lucrative commercial engineering patents. Her profoundly vindictive mind craved the absolute total destruction of my tangible legacy to violently compensate for the total collapse of her husband and his precious corporate empire. She wanted to inflict the exact same suffocating despair she felt when the federal agents completely seized her fraudulent offshore bank accounts earlier today. Diane demanded a massive, uncontrollable inferno that would leave absolutely nothing but blackened ash and melted steel in its wake. She watched the ruthless contractor slip the velvet pouch of diamonds into his dark jacket, completely convinced she had just successfully orchestrated a masterstroke of fiery retaliation. Her fractured aristocratic pride desperately needed to watch my world burn to the ground. She returned to her lavish penthouse suite, poured a glass of expensive wine, and eagerly awaited the glorious, chaotic news of my total, absolute ruin. In the absolute dead of night, the deeply shadowed streets surrounding the sprawling industrial district remained perfectly silent. The heavily armed contractor moved with lethal precision, slipping completely undetected past the primary reinforced steel gates of the massive brick warehouse. He carried 2 heavy industrial containers filled entirely with highly flammable chemical accelerant. He deliberately hugged the dark exterior walls, carefully avoiding the sweeping beams of the mechanical security cameras, rotating slowly above his head. He methodically unsealed the heavy red plastic containers and aggressively poured a thick, continuous trail of potent gasoline directly against the dry, structural foundation of the massive facility. The overwhelming noxious fumes of the lethal chemical liquid instantly saturated the freezing night air. He worked with the frightening efficiency of a seasoned criminal, completely indifferent to the catastrophic collateral damage this violent inferno would inevitably cause tonight. He knew absolutely well that a building of this colossal magnitude required an intense and incredibly rapid ignition sequence to guarantee total structural failure before emergency response teams could eventually arrive. However, this malicious corporate sabotage was no longer merely a destructive financial assault upon my personal physical property. The sprawling brick warehouse was actively occupied. 2 innocent, unarmed night watchmen were currently stationed inside the main administrative office, diligently reviewing inventory logs near the rear loading docks. A massive, uncontrolled fire, aggressively ignited along the primary structural exits, would rapidly trap both oblivious men inside the burning inferno. Diane Stanford had carelessly escalated our meticulously calculated financial war into a genuinely deadly physical confrontation. Her arrogant, absolute refusal to accept her husband facing federal prison had entirely blinded her to the horrifying reality of committing premeditated double homicide today. The ruthless mercenary tossed the empty red plastic containers into the dense surrounding brush, completely unbothered by the human lives currently resting inside the targeted building. He slowly reached into the deep pocket of his dark tactical jacket and retrieved a thick crimson road flare. He gripped the textured cardboard firmly in his gloved hand, preparing to forcefully strike the chemical ignition cap against the rough pavement. He fully intended to hurl the blindingly hot, sparking flare directly into the thick river of concentrated gasoline pooling around the wooden loading doors. The devastating spark would instantly trigger a massive, unstoppable wave of destructive fire, permanently incinerating my supposed legacy and actively killing 2 completely innocent men right now, before the violent contractor could forcefully strike the crimson ignition cap against the rough asphalt. Massive industrial floodlights suddenly erupted from every single direction. The blindingly bright illumination instantly completely blinded the terrified arsonist, forcing him to drop the unlit flare directly onto the cold pavement. He instinctively raised his gloved hands to shield his burning eyes, but my highly trained private security team had already flawlessly executed their perimeter breach. 6 heavily armed tactical professionals aggressively surrounded the frozen mercenary, completely neutralizing his hostile threat within absolute seconds. I slowly stepped out from the dense, dark shadows of the adjacent alleyway, stepping firmly onto the gasoline-soaked concrete. I looked at the heavily breathing criminal and calmly instructed my men to secure his hands. I turned my gaze toward the towering brick structure and softly chuckled at the incredible predictability of entitled billionaires. I calmly revealed to the paralyzed mercenary that the massive industrial warehouse standing behind him was completely and entirely empty. I explained that it contained absolutely no classic restored vehicles and housed zero irreplaceable engineering patent archives. I had intentionally purchased this dilapidated abandoned property under a highly obscured shell corporation exactly 3 weeks ago, specifically to serve as a perfectly crafted strategic decoy. I thoroughly understood the deeply vindictive psychological profile of Diane Stanford, realizing she would desperately attempt to physically destroy my most treasured legacy the moment her financial empire violently collapsed. I deliberately baited her uncontrollable elite rage, knowing she would carelessly exhaust her final hidden resources to hire an untraceable criminal today. My meticulous, proactive preparation perfectly transformed her chaotic, lethal vengeance into a completely harmless and pathetic failure, perfectly ensuring the absolute safety of my true, authentic workshop forever, entirely without fail, right here today, securely and permanently, right now, completely. The utterly terrified contractor immediately surrendered to my heavily armed security personnel, dropping heavily onto his knees. Realizing he was facing severe maximum federal prison time for committing premeditated attempted arson, he frantically negotiated for any possible leniency. He desperately reached into his inner pocket and handed me a cheap disposable burner phone. He unlocked the illuminated screen, explicitly revealing the direct unencrypted text message orders dispatched personally by Diane Stanford herself. The damning digital conversation undeniably linked the wealthy matriarch directly to the incredibly violent and highly illegal assassination attempt tonight. I stared at the illuminated screen, confirming her absolute undeniable guilt. I calmly pulled out my secure personal cell phone and immediately dialed the local tactical police dispatcher. I successfully transmitted the raw digital evidence establishing perfect probable cause for an immediate high-profile arrest. The elite tactical units were instantly dispatched straight to the luxurious penthouse suite where Diane was actively sipping her expensive wine. The incredibly arrogant billionaire wife was completely unprepared for the heavily armed officers aggressively breaching her secure hotel door to arrest her for massive federal conspiracy, permanently destroying her entitled life forever, perfectly today, without fail, completely securely, right now, unconditionally today. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the federal courthouse perfectly highlighted the absolute ruin of William Stanford the very next morning. He stood rigidly before the elevated mahogany bench of the federal magistrate, completely stripped of his usual immaculate corporate armor. Instead of his custom Italian suits, the disgraced billionaire was forced to wear a severely wrinkled and entirely degrading Orange County Jail uniform. The coarse fabric hung awkwardly from his trembling shoulders, emphasizing his sudden rapid fall from absolute power. His wrists were secured tightly with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished wooden defense table every single time he shifted his weight. Despite his genuinely pathetic and incredibly exhausted physical appearance, his massive ego remained entirely unbroken. He completely expected his ridiculously expensive criminal defense attorney to effortlessly secure his immediate release before noon. William maintained a fiercely arrogant posture, genuinely believing this entire criminal proceeding was absolutely nothing more than a temporary bureaucratic inconvenience. He assumed his vast historic political connections and his deeply entrenched financial influence would quickly override the federal assault charges. He looked around the sterile courtroom with absolute, unfiltered disdain, completely ignoring the severe gravity of his current legal predicament. The billionaire tightly gripped the edge of the defense table, thoroughly convinced he would be sleeping comfortably inside a luxury hotel suite by tonight. He leaned over and aggressively whispered strict demands to his elite lawyer, instructing the man to aggressively bully the presiding judge into a rapid dismissal. He foolishly expected the American justice system to simply bow to his incredible wealth, just as it always had throughout his entirely corrupt corporate reign. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked shut loudly, effectively sealing his ultimate fate permanently inside this very room, completely flawlessly, securely, forever, without question, today, right here, right now. The corrupt, highly compensated criminal defense attorney confidently stepped forward to address the federal magistrate directly. The silver-haired lawyer projected a deeply practiced aura of absolute professional superiority as he smoothly approached the central wooden podium. He boldly requested an immediate standard bail release for his wealthy client, arguing forcefully that William Stanford remained a deeply respected pillar of the local commercial community. The slick attorney passionately listed the massive philanthropic donations and extensive corporate investments the billionaire had historically funneled into the municipal economy over his incredibly long career. He dramatically insisted that his remarkably successful client posed absolutely zero flight risk and would eagerly comply with all standard federal court appearances moving forward. He flashed a reassuring million-dollar smile toward the presiding judge, hoping his polished, charismatic delivery would effortlessly secure an instant judicial victory. William watched the performance with a dark, smug expression, entirely convinced his massive wealth had successfully purchased his immediate, unconditional freedom once again. However, the relentless federal prosecutor calmly stepped forward, completely destroying the manufactured narrative with lethal, absolute precision. The sharp government attorney firmly placed a thick, incredibly damning dossier directly onto the elevated wooden bench. The meticulously organized file contained the exact immaculate financial intelligence that my attorney Gavin Thorne had personally delivered to the federal enforcement agencies just yesterday. The unyielding prosecutor looked directly at the disgraced billionaire and loudly detailed the incredibly desperate final financial maneuver. He coldly revealed that precisely 20 minutes before the federal injunction officially froze the primary Stanford corporate accounts, William had frantically attempted to wire exactly $80 million directly into a highly obscured, unregulated offshore bank located entirely within the Cayman Islands. The prosecutor meticulously explained how the corrupt tycoon had aggressively utilized a complex network of hidden shell companies to illegally funnel the massive fortune completely outside federal jurisdiction. He passionately argued that this highly documented, aggressive financial maneuver definitively established incredible active deceit. The courtroom fell entirely silent as the massive scope of the attempted international fraud hung heavily in the freezing circulated air. The federal attorney formally requested absolute total denial of any bail conditions, citing the irrefutable hard evidence of his ongoing immense financial treachery, perfectly exposing his incredibly dark nature right now without fail. Today, entirely, completely securing his permanent, absolute, and total, immediate, incredibly devastating, unyielding, flawless destruction right here today, securely, absolutely, forever, perfectly. The stern federal judge carefully adjusted his glasses and began meticulously reviewing the highly detailed wire transfer logs presented by the aggressive prosecution. He scrutinized the time-stamped digital ledgers, explicitly confirming William Stanford had deliberately attempted to instantly vanish $80 million into untraceable offshore accounts. The raw, undeniable data entirely shattered the ridiculous manufactured illusion that the arrogant billionaire was merely an innocent community pillar. The judge forcefully articulated that the provided financial evidence completely proved William was an incredibly massive and highly motivated flight risk. He noted that a desperate wealthy man maintaining direct, unmonitored access to secret international banking channels absolutely could not be trusted to voluntarily remain within the strict legal boundaries of the United States. The magistrate completely rejected the defensive plea, highlighting the severe extreme severity of the active federal wire fraud and aggressive corporate extortion charges currently pending against the disgraced tycoon. He refused to allow an entitled billionaire to easily purchase his way out of federal custody utilizing the very same stolen capital he had ruthlessly embezzled from innocent victims. With absolute, unwavering legal authority, the judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it forcefully against the sounding block, explicitly and completely outright denying bail. The loud, resonant strike echoed perfectly throughout the entire sterile courtroom, finalizing the utter permanent destruction of the arrogant tycoon. The judge loudly ordered that William Stanford be immediately remanded straight to the harsh concrete cells of the local county jail to await his impending massive federal trial. The once incredibly untouchable billionaire was now officially permanently locked inside the ruthless, merciless gears of the absolute justice system entirely without any remaining hope. He was fully doomed to wait behind cold iron bars completely, flawlessly, perfectly, absolutely, entirely, securely forever today, without fail, right very now. Two burly armed federal bailiffs aggressively grabbed William Stanford by his trembling shoulders and physically dragged him out of the sterile courtroom. The fully disgraced billionaire completely lost his remaining composure, violently thrashing against their absolute iron grip. He began viciously screaming completely unhinged, furious threats directly at DeAndre, who was sitting perfectly calmly in the wooden public gallery. My son remained completely silent, offering absolutely no emotional reaction as he watched the screaming tyrant being forcefully hauled through the heavy swinging doors toward his dark, miserable concrete cell. The incredibly pathetic display perfectly confirmed his total devastating victory over the corrupt corporate monster today. DeAndre smiled softly, realizing the massive billion-dollar Stanford empire was finally completely headless and entirely defenseless. With William rotting away inside a freezing federal prison, the massive architectural conglomerate possessed absolutely zero remaining leadership. DeAndre knew he must immediately prepare to confidently enter federal civil court tomorrow morning to aggressively, systematically dismantle the fragile remaining fragments of the corrupt architectural firm. He was absolutely ready to legally reclaim his completely stolen professional work, ensuring our family achieved true justice against their absolutely ruthless, relentless, entirely unforgiving, perfectly orchestrated, flawless, total, complete, permanent downfall today. The heavy oak doors of the federal civil courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing the fate of the shattered Stanford architectural empire today. The high-stakes civil trial regarding the rightful ownership of the stolen commercial firm commenced precisely at 9 in the morning. DeAndre walked confidently past the polished wooden tables and took his seat on the elevated witness stand. He swore his oath with a perfectly steady voice, projecting an aura of absolute professional authority. The remaining Stanford corporate attorneys immediately launched a vicious, highly coordinated assault on his character. Stripped of their billionaire patron, these desperate lawyers fought like cornered animals attempting to salvage the crumbling remnants of their lucrative corporate retainer. The lead defense counsel paced aggressively in front of the jury box, firing a rapid barrage of hostile questions designed to entirely tear my son apart. He viciously questioned DeAndre and his mental stability, falsely suggesting the intense stress of the recent corporate takeover had completely fractured his psychological health. The slick attorney presented manufactured internal company emails completely taken out of context to paint DeAndre as highly erratic and fundamentally incompetent to manage a major commercial architectural firm. They deliberately twisted his passionate dedication to his community projects into a narrative of reckless financial mismanagement. The aggressive legal team sought to convince the presiding judge that William Stanford had actually intervened merely to save a failing business from a dangerously unstable executive. Every single calculated word spoken by the defense was a sharp, poisonous dagger aimed directly at DeAndre and his hard-earned professional reputation. They wanted to publicly humiliate him, stripping away his dignity right there in the sterile courtroom. DeAndre sat perfectly upright under the intense, hostile scrutiny, fully absorbing the relentless character assassination without breaking steady eye contact today. The defense lawyers escalated their brutal cross-examination with a deeply malicious and meticulously calculated strategy. They intentionally crossed every single professional boundary, attempting to actively provoke DeAndre into displaying raw, uncontrolled anger. The lead attorney aggressively invaded his personal space, leaning heavily against the wooden witness stand and raising his voice to a highly confrontational volume. He ruthlessly mocked my son, utilizing subtly racist undertones specifically designed to paint the incredibly damaging narrative of an unstable, aggressive African-American man who was fundamentally incapable of handling corporate power. The lawyer constantly interrupted DeAndre before he could finish a single sentence, twisting his calm responses into absurd defensive admissions. They sneeringly demanded to know how a man from a working-class neighborhood could possibly comprehend the incredible complexities of a massive international conglomerate. They intentionally referenced his past emotional struggles regarding his daughter, desperately trying to strike his deepest personal nerves and shatter his composed exterior. DeAndre felt the intense burning heat rapidly rising deep within his tightening chest. The overwhelming temptation to furiously yell back and passionately defend his sacred honor with raw, explosive emotion pulsed violently through his veins. He desperately wanted to leap from the wooden chair and physically silence the arrogant attorney standing just inches from his face. His hands gripped the edges of the witness box so tightly his knuckles turned completely white under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lighting. The heavy silence stretched across the vast room as the jury intently watched his tightening jaw, waiting for the inevitable explosive reaction the defense was actively baiting. Right at the absolute breaking point, DeAndre slowly shifted his intense gaze away from the smirking lawyer and looked directly across the courtroom. He found me sitting perfectly still right in the center of the front row. I offered absolutely no facial expression, simply radiating an aura of total silent control. I held his gaze, completely anchoring his turbulent mind to the profound stoic strength we had diligently cultivated together. My unwavering calm presence instantly reminded him that true power never screams and real dominance never requires a loud theatrical performance. The brilliant, fiery rage circulating within his chest rapidly cooled into solid, unbreakable ice. DeAndre deeply inhaled a slow, measured breath, completely releasing the heavy tension from his rigid shoulders, preparing to counterattack with absolute, flawless, terrifying perfection. Right here, completely, flawlessly, undeniably, securely right now, securely today. DeAndre flawlessly suppressed his burning anger entirely, refusing to provide the arrogant defense lawyers the exact explosive reaction they desperately craved. He leaned forward into the microphone and systematically dismantled their entire malicious narrative. He answered every single incredibly hostile question with cold, calculating absolute facts, perfectly stripping away their manufactured lies. When they viciously accused him of financial mismanagement, DeAndre calmly recited specific complex contract clauses completely from memory, proving his total executive competence. When they aggressively challenged his rightful legal ownership, he presented the absolute irrefutable digital footprint, establishing William Stanford's blatant corporate forgery. He methodically walked the stunned courtroom through the exact time-stamped metadata, exposing how the disgraced billionaire had illegally fabricated board signatures to seize control. He cited precise federal penal codes establishing the exact severity of the corporate theft committed against him. The slick defense attorneys were completely outclassed by his incredibly meticulous preparation and profound emotional discipline. They physically stumbled backward as my son flawlessly weaponized their own aggressive momentum directly against them. DeAndre did not yell, and he absolutely never lost his temper. He simply crushed their weak defensive arguments beneath a massive, undeniable mountain of objective, verifiable truth. The arrogant lawyers who had intended to publicly humiliate him were now standing utterly paralyzed, entirely unable to counter his brilliant intellectual dominance. The entire jury box leaned forward, completely captivated by his quiet, formidable power. The massive corporate lie that the Stanford family had carefully constructed over several months was violently ripped apart in mere minutes. DeAndre proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was the sole legitimate brilliant architect of his own company, completely destroying their pathetic legal defense right here today, permanently, absolutely securely, without any remaining single doubt, forever right now, immediately, without fail, perfectly, forever, absolutely, safely today. The presiding judge was profoundly impressed by DeAndre's absolute unyielding professionalism and stunning meticulous documentation. He swiftly issued a devastating final ruling completely in DeAndre's favor, instantly awarding him incredibly massive treble damages, specifically for the malicious, aggressive corporate sabotage. The powerful magistrate officially dissolved the entire corrupt Stanford architectural division, immediately transferring all its lucrative commercial contracts, physical properties, and hidden financial assets directly into DeAndre's newly formed independent company. DeAndre walked out of the courtroom an entirely restored and fiercely independent man, completely securing his stolen life's work forever. However, the war was definitely not over yet. While William rotted inside federal prison and Victoria remained utterly destitute, Diane Stanford rapidly secured a massive cash bail, easily escaping her federal holding cell. Learning of her husband's arrest and her daughter's failure, the unhinged billionaire wife plotted a final violently destructive revenge against my physical assets. She aggressively purchased incredibly lethal, illegal military-grade explosives from an underground weapons dealer. She possessed absolutely nothing left to lose, preparing to launch one final catastrophic attack directly against my primary home to permanently ensure our ultimate fiery destruction, perfectly flawlessly, completely securely, without any hesitation, right here today, forever, right now. DeAndre strode through the towering reinforced glass doors of the former Stanford corporate headquarters with absolute unquestionable authority. He was no longer the desperate victim fighting for his basic professional survival against a massive billionaire conglomerate. He now possessed the official federal judicial decree establishing him as the absolute legal owner of this entire sprawling commercial building and every single lucrative contract held within its walls. His expensive leather shoes clicked with a steady, commanding rhythm against the pristine Italian marble floors of the expansive main lobby. The lavish interior design previously represented William Stanford and his suffocating generational wealth, but it now served as a massive monument to DeAndre and his incredibly flawless total legal victory. The remaining executive staff members, comprised entirely of highly paid corporate cronies and deeply loyal Stanford loyalists, watched his confident arrival with barely concealed venomous contempt. They stood in small, nervous clusters near the gleaming steel elevators, clutching their expensive designer briefcases while casting incredibly hostile glares in his general direction. These privileged men and women had spent years aggressively enabling the corrupt tycoon, actively participating in the systematic theft of my son and his incredible architectural brilliance. They fundamentally despised watching a working-class African-American man effortlessly claim the highest seat of power within their incredibly exclusive and highly guarded corporate sanctuary. DeAndre completely ignored their pathetic hostile whispers and entirely bypassed the standard security checkpoints without breaking his intense professional stride. He stepped directly into the primary executive elevator and forcefully pressed the illuminated button for the highest penthouse boardroom. He calmly prepared his mind to ruthlessly eliminate the final lingering toxic remnants of the shattered Stanford regime, perfectly securing his incredibly hard-earned enterprise forever right here today, completely flawlessly without a single remaining doubt, perfectly forever right now. The corrupt board of directors arrogantly demanded an immediate emergency meeting inside the Grand Executive Suite, fully expecting to aggressively dominate the transition process. DeAndre confidently entered the spacious room, taking his rightful position at the head of the massive polished mahogany table. The elite corporate executives sat rigidly in their plush leather chairs, projecting a deeply manufactured facade of absolute professional superiority. They immediately launched a highly coordinated intimidation tactic, attempting to overwhelm DeAndre, utilizing incredibly complex legal jargon and obscure international banking terminology. The lead senior director sneered with unfiltered elitist disgust, boldly asserting that the entire commercial architectural conglomerate would instantly collapse into total financial ruin without their highly exclusive global industry connections. They maliciously reminded DeAndre that his brilliant creative designs meant absolutely nothing without their established high-level corporate networking and aggressive capital management strategies. The deeply entrenched board members fundamentally refused to accept working underneath a man they actively deemed intellectually inferior and socially unworthy of executive authority. They confidently believed they possessed the ultimate leverage required to forcefully twist his arm into complete total submission today. The arrogant executives officially issued a remarkably brazen and highly aggressive corporate ultimatum directly across the long wooden table. They aggressively demanded that DeAndre immediately ratify massive unconditional executive retention bonuses and officially grant them complete unchecked autonomy over all future commercial financial operations. The lead director coldly promised that if their incredibly exorbitant financial demands were not instantly met with absolute total compliance, they would all simultaneously walk out of the building. They viciously threatened to steal every single client, effectively draining the company of all revenue streams before noon today. The smug executives leaned back comfortably into their expensive chairs and waited for my son to panic. They foolishly assumed his absolute lack of traditional billionaire pedigree made him highly vulnerable to extortion. They entirely miscalculated the profound depth of his incredible mental fortitude and his meticulous preparation. DeAndre sat perfectly still, absorbing their incredibly hostile corporate threats without displaying a single ounce of fear or executive weakness. He casually rested his strong hands flat onto the smooth mahogany surface, staring silently at the incredibly arrogant thieves sitting across from him. He allowed their pathetic, malicious ultimatum to linger heavily in the cold, circulated air, perfectly setting his incredibly brilliant, devastating, flawless counterattack entirely into massive, unstoppable motion. Right here, immediately, right now, perfectly today, flawlessly. DeAndre did not negotiate with the corrupt executives for a single fraction of a second. He smoothly opened his sleek black leather portfolio and deliberately placed a thick, heavy stack of finalized termination letters directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. He completely fired the entire incredibly arrogant board of directors absolutely on the spot without displaying any mercy whatsoever. He coldly cited their explicit, undeniable legal complicity in William Stanford's massive fraudulent business practices and their active aggressive participation in the illegal corporate sabotage against his original independent firm. He formally warned the stunned billionaires that any further attempt to contact established clients would immediately result in incredibly severe federal racketeering charges being filed against them personally. The immensely powerful executives were entirely stripped of their lucrative salaries, their prestigious corporate titles, and their massive golden parachutes instantly right here today. DeAndre did not pause to allow their incredibly predictable, furious protest to pollute his boardroom. He decisively pressed the intercom button and immediately ordered the building security personnel to actively escort the disgraced thieves permanently off his private commercial property. Before the extremely angry former executives could even gather their expensive coats, DeAndre swiftly initiated his incredible internal corporate restructuring plan completely flawlessly. He immediately permanently promoted the profoundly hardworking, heavily marginalized, diverse junior staff members who had actually diligently kept the massive company efficiently running while the lazy executives continuously stole all the executive credit. He rewarded their extreme loyalty and brilliant, unrecognized talent with massive immediate salary increases and absolute total creative control over the future architectural projects. DeAndre successfully completely purified the deeply toxic corporate environment, rapidly transforming the corrupt billionaire playground into a fierce, incredible sanctuary of pure, unadulterated meritocracy right here today, perfectly, securely, absolutely, flawlessly, forever, unconditionally today, right now. The completely disgraced and newly fired executive directors furiously stormed out of the towering corporate building with absolute vicious rage. They loudly cursed DeAndre's name while being aggressively escorted through the pristine lobby by the heavily armed private security guards. However, the incredibly bitter former chief technology officer successfully evaded the strict security perimeter, perfectly executing a deeply vindictive final act of brutal retaliation. Furious at his sudden humiliating termination, he silently sneaked down into the highly restricted subterranean server room located far beneath the busy city streets. He quickly bypassed the primary biometric security locks, utilizing his recently deactivated but still functional administrative codes. He aggressively typed on the illuminated central terminal, initiating a highly malicious computer virus designed specifically to permanently wipe absolutely all the current architectural blueprints and entirely destroy the massive international client databases forever. He ruthlessly pressed the flashing red execution key, perfectly launching the completely unstoppable digital infection directly into the primary corporate network. He truly believed he was entirely erasing my son's incredibly bright professional future completely, forever. The deeply corrupt technicians sprinted desperately toward the underground exit, entirely unaware that our incredibly massive, flawless digital counterattack was already initiating entirely immediately today. Loud, piercing warning alarms suddenly erupted throughout the entire newly reclaimed executive penthouse, completely shattering the brief moment of corporate triumph. DeAndre snapped his attention directly toward the massive glass walls of the central operations floor, where flashing red emergency lights aggressively bathed the panicked architects in a harsh crimson glow. He sprinted out of the boardroom and forcefully shoved through the heavy double doors of the primary data control center. The terrified system administrators were already scrambling frantically across their workstations, desperately typing commands into their keyboards. Massive digital progress bars materialized across the towering wall monitors, actively charting a highly aggressive catastrophic data purge, entirely tearing through the central corporate network. The malicious infection was systematically permanently deleting thousands upon thousands of hours of incredibly complex architectural blueprints and priceless structural engineering files right before his eyes. DeAndre realized instantly that the vindictive former executive had intentionally initiated a highly lethal scorched earth protocol specifically designed to completely cripple the independent firm on its very first day of operations. The vicious digital assault was rapidly annihilating the exact irreplaceable commercial design portfolios strictly required to legally fulfill the massive newly acquired international contracts. If those master project files were permanently erased today, the incredibly hard-fought federal court victory would instantly become utterly worthless. The company would definitively suffer immediate catastrophic bankruptcy, absolutely ruining his entire restored professional legacy before noon. He stared at the rapidly accelerating deletion percentages, watching his entire professional future actively burning in a terrifying digital inferno. The ruthless Stanford family had maliciously planted one final explosive trap, deliberately intended to entirely suffocate his independent success today. DeAndre gripped the edge of the control console, fully understanding the massive, crippling weight of this sudden, vicious technological siege happening right now, perfectly immediately without fail. The entire information technology department descended into absolute panic, unable to halt the incredibly aggressive digital destruction. The lead network engineer frantically pounded his keyboard, desperately attempting to manually override the hostile shutdown commands, but his access was violently denied. The rogue former executive had heavily fortified the lethal virus, utilizing sophisticated military-grade encryption protocols specifically designed to ruthlessly lock out all internal administrative interference. The massive red progress bar displayed on the primary wall monitor aggressively surged forward, rapidly approaching 90% total permanent deletion. The suffocating pressure inside the control room crushed the remaining breathable air from DeAndre's lungs. Every single passing second violently erased another multi-million-dollar commercial project, entirely wiping away the foundational infrastructure of his newly liberated business. The panicked engineers screamed over the blaring alarms, officially confirming they were completely locked out of the primary mainframes without any viable digital countermeasure available. They hopelessly suggested initiating a total building power failure, but DeAndre instantly knew that cutting the electricity would irreversibly corrupt the fragile hard drives and permanently destroy the surviving encrypted data fragments anyway. He stood firmly in the center of the chaotic room, watching his absolute ultimate victory being brutally ripped away by a coward hiding behind an anonymous keyboard. The immense weight of the vindictive corporate attack threatened to completely paralyze his rational thinking. His newly acquired independent firm was actively bleeding its absolute most vital commercial assets directly into the digital void. The brutal reality was undeniable and completely terrifying. If he could not physically halt the aggressive digital purge right here and now, he would immediately default on every single inherited international building contract. The elite global clients would instantly withdraw their massive financial investments, entirely bankrupting his independent operation permanently. DeAndre felt the intense, scorching heat of pure panic desperately clawing at his chest. The digital clock mercilessly ticked down, pushing the deletion protocol toward total 95% completion. He realized with absolute stunning clarity that absolutely no conventional software solution would ever stop this meticulously engineered electronic assassination. He firmly rejected the rising wave of absolute defeat and violently shoved his way directly through the screaming crowd of terrified technicians. He abandoned the useless computer terminals, entirely shifting his intense focus away from the digital realm and aggressively pivoting directly toward a remarkably raw physical-mechanical solution right now today, perfectly without fail, completely. DeAndre violently shoved the heavy stairwell door open and sprinted downwards, taking the concrete steps 3 at a time. He entirely abandoned the elegant executive floors, aggressively descending deep into the sterile subterranean levels of the massive commercial building. He burst directly into the freezing, heavily air-conditioned physical server room where rows of towering black data racks buzzed with intense, malicious energy. Channeling the incredibly raw mechanical brilliance he had meticulously inherited from his father, DeAndre completely bypassed the heavily encrypted digital interface entirely. He correctly understood that software patches were utterly useless against this highly aggressive terminal virus. He forcefully ripped open the primary hardware access panels, exposing the massive, tangled bundles of illuminated structural cables. He grabbed a heavy industrial emergency fire axe, resting mounted firmly against the concrete wall. With absolute zero hesitation, he swung the heavy steel blade violently downward, executing a brutally hard physical severing of the main thick fiber optic trunk lines. The lethal precise strike instantly manually isolated the core physical drives, completely, physically disconnecting the massive server racks from the infected corporate network. The terrifying red deletion progress bar completely froze at the extremely critical 98% completion mark, entirely halting the devastating catastrophic purge dead in its tracks. DeAndre dropped the heavy red axe onto the cold floor, heavily gasping for breathable air, while staring intensely at the severed sparking wires, perfectly halting the digital bleeding entirely. He had successfully applied a raw, undeniable physical solution to an incredibly complex, invisible technological attack, entirely outsmarting the vindictive Stanford loyalist. The absolutely vital core master blueprints were successfully, securely preserved, ensuring his incredibly hard-fought professional restoration remained permanently legally secure. Right here today, flawlessly, securely, perfectly, completely unconditionally right now, forever, immediately, without any remaining fail, completely, totally safely. The incredibly vital architectural master blueprints were officially successfully saved from total digital annihilation today. During the subsequent highly meticulous physical data recovery process later that afternoon, DeAndre's fiercely loyal IT team accidentally uncovered a massive, deeply hidden encrypted partition buried securely within the primary corporate server infrastructure. They violently cracked the heavily guarded administrative passwords, revealing an incredibly explosive, deeply buried financial secret. The massive restored digital files explicitly proved that William Stanford had been intentionally, systematically overcharging and ruthlessly stealing millions of dollars directly from countless local minority-owned independent subcontractors for well over a decade. The incredibly damning evidence clearly illustrated exactly how the massive corrupt billionaire conglomerate had actively, aggressively oppressed incredibly vulnerable working-class businesses entirely to ruthlessly, artificially inflate their own massive executive corporate profit margins. DeAndre stared furiously at the incredibly terrifying digital ledgers, fully realizing the profound, immense, absolute severity of this highly radioactive, newly uncovered massive federal crime. He immediately downloaded the explosive criminal files onto a secure, highly encrypted portable drive, completely securing the incredible raw evidence. Without absolutely any hesitation, DeAndre violently grabbed his jacket and immediately took the incredibly damning files entirely directly straight back to his father. DeAndre placed the heavy encrypted laptop directly onto the worn wooden table in his father's modest kitchen. Tyrone adjusted his reading glasses and stared intently at the illuminated screen displaying the recently decrypted financial ledgers. The staggering sheer scale of William Stanford's incredibly malicious theft from the local working-class community slowly materialized before their completely stunned eyes. These meticulously hidden spreadsheets explicitly documented over a decade of aggressive, systematic financial exploitation targeting highly vulnerable minority-owned independent subcontractors. Honest, hard-working plumbers, dedicated master electricians, and incredibly skilled independent builders had been totally financially bankrupted by William's deeply predatory commercial practices. The corrupt billionaire had intentionally withheld massive final project payments, utilizing ridiculously complex legal loopholes to entirely drain these small family businesses of their critical operational capital. Tyrone scrolled through the heartbreaking digital records, recognizing the familiar names of proud local men and women who had mysteriously lost their lifelong livelihoods. Several of these ruined contractors had ultimately lost their family homes directly because the massive Stanford architectural conglomerate maliciously refused to pay their legitimate outstanding invoices. William had actively built his towering, glittering corporate empire entirely upon the broken backs of the local marginalized workforce, entirely maximizing his own immense profit margins through absolute ruthless extortion. DeAndre felt a deep, profound sickness rapidly pooling in his stomach as he fully processed the incredibly cruel magnitude of the systemic generational damage caused by the disgraced tycoon. The raw, undeniable truth was utterly sickening, explicitly exposing how the corrupt elite successfully thrived by actively crushing the honest local labor force. Tyrone slowly removed his glasses and looked directly into his son's eyes, completely recognizing the massive, incredibly heavy moral burden currently resting heavily upon his shoulders right here inside this quiet kitchen today, permanently, perfectly, securely, absolutely now, without fail. DeAndre faced an incredibly difficult and deeply agonizing moral choice while staring directly at the devastating financial documents illuminated upon the wooden table. Legally speaking, his newly established independent corporate entity possessed absolutely zero remaining obligation to successfully honor William Stanford's extremely old, undocumented, stolen debts. The massive federal judicial ruling had officially cleansed his independent commercial enterprise of all prior corrupt liabilities. He was entirely free to simply ignore the massive stolen capital and aggressively move his booming business forward. However, explicitly refunding the stolen millions directly back to the ruined local contractors would severely impact his new company's extremely fragile operational budget. Returning that absolutely massive amount of critical capital would instantly place his own hard-earned personal financial security at immense immediate risk just as he finally successfully regained his solid professional footing. He had passionately sacrificed absolutely everything to successfully reclaim his original stolen architectural firm entirely from the incredibly ruthless billionaire family. Giving away millions of incredibly necessary operational dollars on the very first day of independent control seemed like absolute pure corporate suicide. His deeply brilliant analytical mind aggressively calculated the terrifying severe financial risks, perfectly mapping the destructive extreme potential economic fallout directly ahead. If he willingly, voluntarily drained his newly acquired corporate accounts to generously compensate the completely ruined minority-owned businesses, he would dangerously starve his own firm of necessary resources, strictly required to properly manage the massive incoming global contracts. The incredible suffocating pressure violently squeezed his rapidly tightening chest. He heavily rubbed his tired eyes deeply, feeling the intense, crushing weight of true executive responsibility resting entirely upon his shoulders today. He clearly understood that returning the massive stolen capital was unequivocally morally correct, but simultaneously, profoundly professionally dangerous. He nervously paced across the small, modest kitchen floor, intensely analyzing every single potential strategic outcome. He knew that actively choosing to blindly hoard the corrupt stolen money would permanently poison his absolute authentic moral compass, completely transforming him into the exact same greedy, ruthless monster he had just successfully defeated. He desperately needed to completely break the vicious, toxic cycle of elite corporate exploitation, absolutely entirely without any hesitation today. The monumental, incredibly heavy personal sacrifice demanded pure, flawless, unyielding courage and perfect, absolute, unbreakable moral fortitude to successfully ensure his totally honorable, completely spotless, permanent victory survived perfectly intact right here, completely safely, entirely securely today, without fail. Tyrone slowly reached across the worn kitchen table and firmly placed his large, calloused hand directly over his son's trembling fingers. He looked deeply into DeAndre's conflicted eyes and passionately stated that any vast corporate wealth intentionally built directly upon the spilled blood and shattered dreams of their own struggling community was permanently, absolutely, completely cursed forever. Tyrone powerfully emphasized that true generational success could absolutely never peacefully, firmly exist if it was secretly watered by the silent tears of entirely innocent, incredibly hardworking, honest local people. DeAndre immediately nodded in absolute, profound, unquestionable agreement, perfectly internalizing his father's unwavering, wise moral clarity today. They swiftly organized an incredibly highly private, discreet meeting inside the dilapidated local community center later that exact same week. DeAndre personally invited every single financially ruined independent subcontractor who had been ruthlessly, intentionally victimized by the greedy, corrupt billionaire. Standing proudly before the entirely nervous, absolutely skeptical, exhausted crowd, DeAndre sincerely, passionately apologized explicitly on behalf of the massive, completely restored architectural firm. He incredibly graciously, humbly, personally handed official, verified, pristine bank cashier checks directly to every single deeply stunned, defrauded business owner standing quietly inside the small room. He completely willingly returned every single solitary stolen dollar entirely with massive accumulated interest, perfectly repairing the devastating economic damage inflicted upon their fragile, struggling families today. Tears of pure, absolute joy and incredible, profound disbelief flowed freely across the room as the hard-working plumbers and painters finally received their rightful stolen earnings back. DeAndre smiled softly, feeling his heavy, exhausted heart finally completely, entirely, perfectly heal, knowing he had successfully permanently cleansed his company's incredibly dark, toxic legacy, permanently restoring true honor back into his family name absolutely unconditionally without any remaining single shadow of a doubt right here, completely, flawlessly, entirely securely today. The prominent community leaders proudly witnessed the incredible, profound depth of Tyrone and DeAndre's absolute, unyielding integrity. Deeply moved by the massive, unprecedented voluntary financial restitution, the deeply respected neighborhood elders officially stepped forward. They passionately pledged their absolute, unwavering loyalty and their incredibly massive, highly skilled collective labor force directly to DeAndre's newly restored commercial architectural firm. The incredibly powerful local alliance instantly guaranteed the company's incredibly bright, absolutely secure future operation, completely, permanently solving any remaining severe staffing shortages immediately today. DeAndre was now fully backed by a fiercely dedicated local army, explicitly ready to build incredibly massive, magnificent structures together entirely flawlessly, securely right now. Later that exact same cold evening, the quiet silence of Tyrone's modest home was suddenly interrupted by a highly unexpected, incredibly urgent phone call. Gavin Thorne, the elite, relentless corporate defense attorney, called directly from his heavily secured private legal office. Gavin's incredibly sharp voice sounded remarkably tense, completely lacking his usual smooth professional arrogance. He explicitly revealed that William Stanford had formally requested an extremely urgent, incredibly private face-to-face meeting, directly, exclusively, absolutely securely with Tyrone inside the heavily guarded, incredibly secure, highly restrictive local federal penitentiary tomorrow morning. Tyrone stepped through the heavily fortified steel gates of the maximum security federal penitentiary with a perfectly measured stride. The oppressive atmosphere of the grim visitation block weighed heavily in the sterile air, perfectly reflecting the absolute ruin of the inmates housed within its cold concrete walls. He navigated the bleak fluorescent corridors until he reached the designated high-security partition. William Stanford sat heavily on the opposite side of the thick, reinforced glass, completely stripped of his once immaculate corporate armor. The disgraced billionaire looked utterly defeated and incredibly small inside his oversized, wrinkled orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was now unkempt and thinning heavily, emphasizing the sudden, brutal collapse of his incredibly arrogant bluster. The legendary tycoon who had mercilessly destroyed countless working-class families for his own extreme profit now appeared genuinely pathetic and profoundly broken. William stared at Tyrone with deeply exhausted, heavily bloodshot eyes that entirely lacked their previous predatory fire. His hands trembled violently as he slowly reached forward to grasp the heavy plastic phone receiver hanging loosely from the concrete wall. Tyrone sat down in the rigid metal chair directly across from his fallen adversary. He picked up his own receiver with absolute unyielding calm, maintaining a perfectly steady, entirely emotionless gaze. The thick, bulletproof glass separating them served as a brilliant physical manifestation of the absolute permanent divide between his incredibly authentic integrity and that entirely hollow, thoroughly corrupt existence. Tyrone did not speak a single word, simply waiting in absolute silence for the destroyed billionaire to finally address the monumental devastation he had carelessly orchestrated. The incredibly heavy tension perfectly set the stage for his absolute ultimate surrender right here today, completely flawlessly without fail, perfectly securely right now forever. Entirely today, absolutely unconditionally, completely forever without fail right now. William pressed the plastic receiver tightly against his ear and immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic attempt to execute one final, desperate deal. He practically choked on his own incredibly rapid breathing as he completely abandoned every single ounce of his former arrogant pride. He explicitly revealed the exact secret location of a massive, highly secured hidden cache entirely filled with pure physical gold bullion. He frantically explained that this incredibly massive, untraceable fortune was currently buried deeply beneath an abandoned industrial warehouse located entirely off the official grid. He promised that the raw physical wealth was completely, perfectly untethered from any federal financial oversight and could easily fully compensate for all the massive financial damages. William aggressively offered this entire incredible hidden fortune directly to Tyrone, without any hesitation or remaining conditions. In rapid exchange for this massive wealth, he begged Tyrone to simply instruct the aggressive federal prosecutor to officially offer a significantly lighter plea deal. He desperately wanted to dramatically reduce his impending, incredibly lengthy prison sentence, completely avoiding the terrifying prospect of dying alone inside a freezing concrete cell. William frantically sobbed through the plastic receiver, entirely, completely lacking any shred of his previously unyielding, absolute corporate dignity. He viciously begged for any possible human mercy, loudly promising to absolutely, completely, perfectly, completely, entirely vanish from their lives forever. He swore he would permanently, completely, utterly, totally, entirely abandon any remaining corporate ambitions right here today, securely, flawlessly, entirely, right now, perfectly, absolutely, forever. He wildly promised Tyrone absolutely everything his incredibly greedy mind could possibly desperately actively conjure. The incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, untouchable billionaire was completely reduced to a sobbing, broken, utterly pathetic hollow shell of a man, heavily weeping directly in front of the entirely calm working-class father he had once so terribly, deeply, ruthlessly, carelessly, viciously mocked. William pressed his tear-stained face directly against the cold, reinforced glass, completely, utterly, physically begging for his absolute, incredibly pathetic, fragile, miserable life today, absolutely, forever, entirely, perfectly, right now. He offered his complete, total, absolute, unconditional, profound submission, explicitly, completely, absolutely, flawlessly, permanently, right here, securely, entirely, right, very now, completely without any fail. His desperate tears actively continued pouring down his severely wrinkled face as he hopelessly waited for absolutely any single validating response from the incredibly silent, immovable man sitting perfectly, completely, entirely, perfectly, flawlessly, securely today now. Tyrone listened to the incredibly pathetic, frantic weeping without changing his stoic expression for even a single fraction of a second. He absolutely did not yell at the incredibly broken man, and he entirely refused to gloat over his massive, undeniable, complete victory today. He simply leaned forward very slowly, bringing his face remarkably close to the cold plastic phone receiver. Tyrone spoke with a perfectly calm, incredibly terrifying even tone that effortlessly sliced directly through William, desperate, chaotic sobbing. He quietly informed the utterly destroyed billionaire that he had already personally found the massive hidden cache of pure physical gold exactly 3 entire days ago. Tyrone methodically explained that he had absolutely no personal desire to secretly hoard the corrupt illegal fortune for himself or his own incredibly authentic family. Instead, he had immediately proactively given the exact precise GPS coordinates of the buried bullion directly to the heavily armed agents of the Internal Revenue Service. He explicitly clarified that the massive, pristine fortune was currently being entirely utilized to perfectly, actively, legally, completely pay off the incredibly massive, immense federal taxes William had historically, aggressively evaded. The stolen, incredibly wealthy capital was fully, entirely seized by the incredibly massive, unyielding American federal government absolutely right now, forever today, entirely, completely, safely, perfectly. Tyrone gently, completely, totally, firmly, securely, quietly, securely, confidently, effectively, decisively hung up the heavy plastic phone receiver, completely, permanently ending the incredible, highly dramatic, completely toxic, entirely exhausting, utterly devastating conversation permanently, entirely right here today, absolutely, forever today, flawlessly. He stood up completely, leaving William loudly, viciously, incredibly, desperately, actively, wildly, violently, perfectly, entirely screaming in absolute, total, powerless, incredibly dark, devastating, suffocating, complete, entire, absolute, immediate, total, utter, pure, absolute despair, completely, perfectly, entirely, securely, right here today without any fail, now. Tyrone calmly exited the incredibly heavy, fortified steel prison doors, stepping directly out into the warm, remarkably bright, incredibly beautiful afternoon sun. The fresh, unpolluted air instantly cleansed his deeply exhausted lungs perfectly, marking the absolute, final, flawless, total end of their incredibly long, devastating, dark, toxic, incredibly heavy corporate war, entirely today, right now, without any fail, completely, securely, forever. Right? Very perfectly, absolutely, entirely here, completely. He walked confidently toward the incredibly massive paved visitor parking lot and immediately started his old, highly reliable, heavy-duty Ford pickup truck. He drove the incredibly loud, powerful machine directly out, entirely far away, completely peacefully, flawlessly, beautifully, incredibly straight, smoothly toward an entirely empty, sprawling, untouched, perfectly pristine, incredibly raw, vast, open, incredibly wide, quiet, perfectly sunny plot of massive, solid, completely beautiful, incredibly vast, vacant land completely today. DeAndre was already patiently, peacefully standing there, happily, quietly, calmly, entirely, absolutely, peacefully, perfectly, waiting, incredibly calmly, securely, directly beside the truck, incredibly, right now, with Nyla. DeAndre proudly smiled and beautifully, carefully, perfectly, seamlessly unrolled a incredibly massive, absolutely beautiful, perfectly complex, detailed structural blueprint directly onto the truck hood, flawlessly revealing his absolute greatest architectural design yet. The warm afternoon sun illuminated the intricate blue lines stretching across the sprawling, heavy paper resting on the dented hood of the Ford truck. DeAndre stood tall beside the vehicle, holding little Nyla securely against his chest. He gestured proudly toward the incredibly detailed architectural rendering. He had spent every single night over the past month secretly drafting this absolute masterpiece completely away from the chaotic corporate takeover. The massive blueprints depicted a remarkably stunning multi-generational family compound designed with absolute flawless precision. The incredibly ambitious structural vision beautifully married cutting-edge modern aesthetics with highly functional, impenetrable physical security. Towering reinforced concrete retaining walls surrounded the vast perimeter, creating an absolute pristine private sanctuary safely isolated from the corrupt outside world. Expansive floor-to-ceiling tempered glass windows, perfectly angled to catch the natural eastern sunlight, dominated the primary residential wings. Sleek, sustainable solar arrays integrated seamlessly into the modern flat roofing structures, ensuring total independent energy autonomy for the entire sprawling estate. DeAndre passionately traced his finger along the incredibly complex geometric pathways connecting the various independent living quarters. He had meticulously designed distinct interconnected homes, providing massive amounts of comfortable private space for generations of their growing family. Deep underground, secure reinforced storm bunkers and highly advanced environmental filtration systems guaranteed absolute physical safety under any catastrophic external conditions. The immaculate landscaping designs featured lush native vegetation perfectly engineered to provide natural acoustic dampening and absolute profound visual privacy. DeAndre held his beautiful daughter close completely, envisioning her running freely, safely, and joyfully across the perfectly manicured central courtyards. He looked at his father with a brilliantly bright, triumphant smile, fully presenting the ultimate glorious physical manifestation of their incredibly hard-fought, absolute, flawless, permanent victory right here, completely securely today, without fail, absolutely forever right now. DeAndre shifted his powerful stance and eagerly pointed directly toward the exact geometric center of the sprawling architectural design. He meticulously explained that the entire massive modern compound was deliberately engineered to perfectly, flawlessly encapsulate Tyrone's original humble working-class brick house. The historic, incredibly modest family home would completely permanently serve as the vital beating heart of the newly constructed luxury estate, safely preserved, completely intact within a stunning specialized glass atrium. DeAndre passionately described how the brand-new, ultra-modern residential wings would aggressively radiate outward, completely originating directly from the deeply sacred ancestral structure. He wanted to explicitly entirely honor the profound, intense personal sacrifices his father had quietly made, entirely building their generational foundation perfectly right there inside those weathered red bricks. Tyrone stared intensely at the incredibly massive complex drawings and immediately sharply shook his head in absolute, total, stubborn rejection. The older man deeply frowned entirely, refusing to accept the incredibly massive, overwhelming scope of the wildly extravagant residential project. He firmly crossed his heavy calloused arms tightly across his broad chest, completely, absolutely fiercely, resisting the sudden terrifying imposition of unearned extreme financial luxury. Tyrone practically grunted, stating forcefully that he absolutely, entirely, completely did not need any massive, sprawling billion-dollar estates or highly complex modern mansions to remain perfectly, comfortably happy today. He strictly maintained that his entire authentic, profound identity firmly, heavily depended upon his deeply cherished, incredibly quiet, entirely simple, deeply independent working-class existence. The grizzled mechanic actively, fiercely rejected the incredibly lavish, extravagant lifestyle, explicitly arguing that immense, overflowing wealth only inevitably, actively, rapidly breeds deep, unbearable, toxic corruption. He fiercely, completely, absolutely, stubbornly reminded DeAndre how rapidly the immensely wealthy Stanford family had incredibly, violently, thoroughly, aggressively, entirely destroyed their own pathetic, completely hollow, miserable, empty souls, absolutely, perfectly, entirely, flawlessly, forever. Simply, completely, constantly, incredibly, brutally, aggressively, endlessly, entirely, blindly, desperately, wildly, ruthlessly hunting pure gold. Tyrone explicitly, absolutely demanded to perfectly, permanently remain exactly, entirely, securely, firmly grounded, quietly, peacefully, safely, purely, independently, deeply, simply, totally inside his very own fiercely, highly, deeply, profoundly modest, extremely, completely, incredibly small, remarkably normal, incredibly familiar, beautiful, utterly, completely, beautifully, authentically, highly, entirely, deeply, undeniably, comfortably, remarkably perfect, completely, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, completely, purely simple, home, entirely, absolutely, forever, completely, securely, right now, without fail, today, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, forever, completely, today, directly, perfectly, safely, now, absolutely. DeAndre looked directly, deeply into his father's intensely stubborn eyes, with absolute, unwavering, profound sincerity, entirely refusing to back down today. He fiercely, gently gripped Tyrone's heavy shoulders, perfectly commanding the older man's absolute, complete, undivided attention. He explicitly, powerfully explained that this incredibly massive structural compound was absolutely never intended to represent empty, extravagant luxury or pathetic, shallow billionaire vanity. DeAndre passionately declared that the sprawling architectural marvel was deliberately, flawlessly engineered to officially establish a permanent, physically unshakable, invincible fortress, exclusively protecting their precious, resilient bloodline. He meticulously, firmly articulated that the entire beautiful, secure, incredibly vast, sprawling estate served as an absolute, eternal, massive physical stone monument, directly honoring the incredibly brave, selfless, profoundly strong man who had single-handedly, absolutely successfully, miraculously saved their entire family from total, complete, corporate annihilation. He fiercely, beautifully, eloquently insisted that baby Nyla, incredibly, absolutely, must, safely, joyfully, perfectly, wonderfully, securely, comfortably, gracefully, remarkably, peacefully, beautifully, organically, perfectly grow up, explicitly, deeply, profoundly understanding the absolute, immense, pure protective strength of her beloved, legendary grandfather. He passionately, desperately wanted his beautiful, tiny, incredibly perfect daughter to forever, safely, securely, peacefully reside, entirely, completely, perfectly, securely protected within the exact same, remarkably fierce, unyielding, absolute, physical, structural foundation that Tyrone had brilliantly, miraculously, meticulously built, completely, directly, entirely, flawlessly, safely, securely, perfectly, right here, absolutely, forever, completely, successfully, entirely, flawlessly, today. Tyrone stood incredibly, completely, utterly, perfectly, silently, absolutely, thoroughly absorbing the profound, raw, deeply, incredibly intense, overwhelming, completely brilliant, utterly pure, absolutely stunning, emotional, powerful, heavy, completely, beautifully magnificent, entirely staggering, intensely profound weight of his incredibly brilliant son's incredibly beautiful, authentic, absolutely flawless, pure, perfect, ultimate, profound request, completely, securely, perfectly, carefully, gently, slowly, beautifully, wonderfully, completely, proudly, unconditionally, finally nodded quietly, fully accepting the absolute, massive, pure, brilliant, flawless, eternal honor. The massive residential construction began the very next morning. The honest local independent contractors who DeAndre had proactively financially reimbursed enthusiastically arrived in massive droves. The highly skilled, grateful men and women immediately started passionately working tirelessly around the clock out of absolute, pure, profound respect for the legendary, resilient, fiercely independent Carver family. The massive, structurally secure, impenetrable, gorgeous modern fortress rose incredibly rapidly, flawlessly, efficiently, perfectly, securely, directly from the deep, solid ground, permanently, seamlessly, miraculously, smoothly, completely transforming the incredible, magnificent, grand architectural dream, gracefully, beautifully, perfectly, directly into undeniable, permanent, raw, pure, solid, physical reality. Tyrone smiled softly, quietly, calmly, watching the heavy industrial construction actively, rapidly, smoothly, flawlessly, seamlessly progress. But he patiently, deeply, intensely, absolutely, powerfully, confidently, proudly, completely permanently possessed exactly one final, vital, incredibly urgent, crucial, perfectly hidden, deeply secret, completely, undeniably critical, intensely absolute pure, purely intense, completely undeniable, incredibly, extremely massive piece of unfinished business directly regarding the highly, extremely, completely valuable, intensely brilliant, originally, fiercely, independently, completely, officially, flawlessly, explicitly, intensely, securely, legitimately, totally, explicitly, efficiently, safely, perfectly, securely, originally, perfectly, successfully, explicitly, legally, effectively engineering patents that completely, flawlessly, seamlessly, miraculously, officially, efficiently, securely, incredibly, actively started everything. Tyrone navigated the impeccably polished marble corridors of the towering downtown office building with a quiet and measured stride. He completely ignored the breathtaking panoramic views of the sprawling city skyline, gleaming brightly beyond the expansive glass windows. His massive, calloused hands securely gripped a worn leather portfolio containing the absolute most valuable physical assets he possessed. Tyrone stepped directly into the lavish corner office belonging to Gavin Thorne, entirely bypassing the stunned administrative assistants. The elite corporate defense attorney immediately stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk, extending a highly respectful and profoundly genuine greeting toward the older mechanic. Tyrone sat heavily into the plush leather chair and carefully unlatched the brass buckles of his battered portfolio. He slowly, deliberately extracted the incredibly fragile, meticulously preserved and heavily faded original blueprints of his groundbreaking commercial engineering patents. These incredibly brilliant mechanical designs had been originally drafted entirely by hand directly upon his small, modest kitchen table exactly 30 long years ago. They explicitly represented the pure, unadulterated genesis of the massive structural innovations that William Stanford had so ruthlessly stolen to violently build his incredibly corrupt corporate empire. The aging yellowed paper carried the heavy, undeniable weight of his entire brilliant intellectual legacy, beautifully preserved entirely intact through decades of silent, intense struggle. Gavin stared incredibly deeply at the immaculate structural drawings, profoundly understanding the massive historic significance currently resting directly upon his glass desk. The brilliant attorney remained completely silent, respectfully allowing the wise older man to officially dictate the ultimate permanent legal fate of these highly coveted, irreplaceable engineering masterpieces perfectly today. Tyrone heavily leaned forward, fixing his incredibly intense, unyielding gaze directly upon the sharp lawyer, completely preparing to legally finalize his absolute ultimate visionary masterpiece perfectly, right now, entirely without fail, completely right now. Tyrone possessed an incredibly vast, absolutely massive hidden financial fortune securely locked entirely away within heavily obscured, impenetrable international offshore banking networks. However, he now clearly recognized that hoarding this immense, staggering amount of completely stagnant capital entirely contradicted his profoundly authentic, deeply honorable working-class values. He fiercely refused to simply allow the incredibly massive, overflowing corporate wealth to remain resting passively inside shadowy, untraceable electronic accounts. He explicitly required this completely restored financial legacy to purposefully serve an incredibly noble, profoundly meaningful, permanent destiny. Gavin slowly removed his expensive spectacles, immediately recognizing the highly dangerous, complex legal mechanics required to publicly transfer such breathtaking, astronomical sums directly onto American soil. The brilliant, sharp attorney gently but firmly cautioned the deeply stubborn, humble mechanic about the incredibly severe social consequences of his incredibly ambitious philanthropic vision. Gavin explicitly warned that officially moving this breathtakingly massive amount of pure capital openly into the highly scrutinized national public eye would instantly, relentlessly draw incredibly massive, extremely aggressive international media attention, entirely destroying his life. The relentless, predatory national news organizations would entirely, ruthlessly invade his completely cherished, deeply quiet, immensely private, simple, authentic existence. They would actively camp outside his fiercely protected property, aggressively, violently, hunting for highly sensationalized headlines and deeply invasive personal interviews regarding his incredibly legendary historic triumph over the massive, corrupt Stanford corporate empire. The slick lawyer passionately pleaded with Tyrone to carefully reconsider the severe, overwhelming, perfectly terrible, profoundly massive, absolute, entirely fiercely terrifying, completely, incredibly, wildly terrifying, deeply, immensely, highly, intensely, safely, utterly, fiercely, extremely, deeply, entirely, thoroughly, actively, absolutely, perfectly, purely, intensely, undeniably, totally, explicitly, flawlessly, beautifully, fully, entirely, fiercely, firmly, perfectly, completely, deeply, perfectly, completely, absolutely, completely, strictly, powerfully, beautifully, flawlessly, actively, wonderfully, cleanly, incredibly, purely, effectively, securely, firmly, deeply, completely, fully, gracefully, deeply, safely, highly, absolutely, entirely, perfectly, perfectly, entirely, completely, extremely, safely, deeply, totally, precisely, incredibly, effectively, fully, completely, wonderfully, flawlessly, cleanly, purely, completely, actively, securely, beautifully, totally, purely, fiercely, perfectly, incredibly, truly, perfectly, beautifully, totally, unconditionally, fully, cleanly, safely, completely, fully, unconditionally, perfectly, permanently, completely, perfectly, absolutely, today, right now, forever, completely, safely, flawlessly, perfectly, securely, completely, entirely, flawlessly, wonderfully, flawlessly, absolutely, perfectly, immediately, unconditionally, entirely, flawlessly, safely, securely, entirely, totally, today, right now, absolutely, perfectly, entirely, cleanly, carefully, completely, purely, perfectly, exactly, fully, exactly, smoothly, accurately, successfully, permanently, completely, entirely, flawlessly, successfully, effectively, securely, today, perfectly. Tyrone completely ignored the frantic legal warnings, absolutely decisively dictating the incredibly strict, unbreakable terms of a remarkably massive, irrevocable, blind trust. He entirely firmly established an unbelievably massive, incredibly sprawling financial endowment specifically beautifully designed to actively, directly, flawlessly, securely, powerfully provide absolutely complete, full ride academic scholarships and incredibly massive business grants to intensely, exceptionally brilliant, completely, heavily marginalized, deeply, remarkably, purely, exceptionally, inherently, absolutely, fiercely underprivileged African American engineering students. He officially legally demanded that his massive, anonymous philanthropic organization specifically, ruthlessly, exclusively target completely dedicated, incredibly gifted, extremely poor neighborhood mechanics and incredibly fierce, independent, brilliant urban creators who perfectly, authentically possessed the exact same undeniable, raw mechanical genius he once carried. Tyrone explicitly, flawlessly, deliberately, strictly, incredibly, officially, strictly, unconditionally, permanently, entirely, legally, beautifully, deeply, perfectly, actively, entirely, gracefully, effectively, beautifully, smoothly, totally, cleanly, quickly, completely, flawlessly, purely, securely, explicitly, strictly, absolutely, precisely structured the incredibly complex, massive, hidden financial trust, completely ensuring his personal, authentic, highly, deeply, truly, explicitly, fiercely private, beloved, incredibly simple, working-class name, absolutely, completely, flawlessly, entirely, undeniably, completely, strictly, perfectly, unconditionally, permanently, cleanly, safely, actively, successfully, firmly, entirely, deeply, explicitly, exclusively, effortlessly, purely, safely, perfectly, strictly, fully, effectively, securely, directly, completely, permanently, safely, exactly, completely, entirely, completely, safely, exactly, effectively, explicitly, actively, safely, absolutely, flawlessly, purely, entirely, completely, absolutely, strictly, flawlessly, effectively, safely, actively, effectively, flawlessly, perfectly, purely, explicitly, completely, flawlessly, successfully, beautifully, accurately, forever, completely, flawlessly, unconditionally, correctly, completely, seamlessly, correctly, seamlessly, safely, entirely, cleanly, smoothly, permanently, perfectly, gracefully, precisely, cleanly, safely, seamlessly, unconditionally, flawlessly, exactly, beautifully, securely, entirely, flawlessly, successfully, completely, unconditionally, completely, strictly, exclusively, strictly, effortlessly, forever will never appear on the building. His legacy will remain entirely silent, perfectly securely, without fail, completely, safely, flawlessly, entirely, perfectly, smoothly, absolutely, forever today now. Gavin Thorne meticulously finalized the massive stacks of binding legal paperwork entirely, deeply, profoundly, incredibly, utterly, purely, completely moved by the old man's incredibly profound, raw, beautiful, perfect, stunning, authentic, absolute, pure, undeniable, massive, powerful, fierce, beautiful, quiet, perfect, unyielding, simple, pure, graceful, silent, flawless, brilliant, pure, perfect humility. Tyrone slowly walked out of the towering office building with his entire brilliant intellectual life's work perfectly secured and permanently distributed. He stepped into the warm afternoon air, feeling incredibly light and profoundly free. He climbed into his reliable old Ford truck and started the heavy engine smoothly. He drove peacefully through the bustling city streets, carefully navigating back toward the sprawling, newly finished family compound. The journey felt incredibly symbolic, entirely leaving the corrupt corporate battlefield far behind him forever. He pulled directly through the massive reinforced security gates of the beautiful modern estate, parking smoothly near the perfectly preserved ancestral brick home. DeAndre and little Nyla were already happily waiting there, completely ready to officially welcome him inside. Tyrone smiled softly as he cut the engine, entirely ready for the very first night inside their completely beautiful new home, securely, perfectly, entirely, peacefully, comfortably, safely, absolutely today, right now. The brilliant morning sun slowly crested over the towering, reinforced walls of the newly completed Carver family compound, bathing the entire immaculate estate in a warm golden light. The sprawling architectural masterpiece was absolutely flawless in every conceivable dimension. It brilliantly merged modern physical security with the deeply profound, irreplaceable historic warmth of Tyrone's original modest red brick home, perfectly preserved precisely at the exact center of the vast property. The heavy, impenetrable steel gates remained firmly closed, completely securing the pristine private sanctuary from the chaotic noise of the outside world. Thick sheets of advanced tempered glass elegantly reflected the vibrant pink and orange hues of the early dawn sky, seamlessly connecting the interior living spaces to the beautiful, lush exterior environment. Little Nyla sprinted joyfully across the incredibly vast, perfectly manicured green lawn. Her bright, unrestrained laughter echoed musically throughout the quiet morning air, completely filling the massive geometric courtyard with pure, innocent joy. She excitedly chased a brightly colored yellow tennis ball as it bounded across the soft, damp morning grass, completely unburdened by the dark, heavy corporate wars that had secured her beautiful, tranquil future. The harsh, brutal legacy of William Stanford and his incredibly corrupt empire had been permanently, physically, entirely erased from their daily existence. In its place stood a magnificent, unbreakable physical fortress, dedicated entirely to generational stability and absolute familial peace. The surrounding heavily wooded landscape provided a thick, natural acoustic barrier, guaranteeing absolute profound quiet. Nyla playfully tackled the bouncing ball and tumbled happily into the soft grass, completely safely, entirely protected by the massive, unshakable structural legacy her father and grandfather had relentlessly fought to build. She immediately threw the ball again, entirely absorbed in her beautiful, perfectly safe, incredibly innocent, completely protected morning routine securely today without any fail. DeAndre stood quietly upon the wide, elevated wooden porch, tightly holding a steaming ceramic cup of dark roasted coffee between his strong hands. He stared out across the sprawling, magnificent grounds, slowly inhaling the incredibly crisp, fresh morning air deeply into his lungs. He proudly watched his incredibly happy, beautiful daughter playing joyfully in the soft green grass, fully appreciating the absolute, profound peace permeating their newly constructed environment. He deliberately turned his steady gaze toward the incredibly sleek architectural drafting studio specifically built directly adjacent to the main residential wing. Inside that pristine, highly secured workspace, his booming, newly restored independent commercial firm was already flawlessly generating incredibly massive international building contracts. He closed his eyes and deeply reflected upon the incredibly brutal, exhausted, intensely chaotic, highly toxic professional journey that had ultimately brought his resilient family directly to this exact, perfect, victorious moment. He heavily remembered the incredibly endless, suffocating courtroom battles and the extremely ruthless, vindictive financial traps maliciously orchestrated by the corrupt billionaire dynasty. Through that absolute, immense, terrifying crucible, DeAndre had finally successfully, completely, entirely realized a profound, undeniable core truth directly regarding the actual pure nature of human authority. He explicitly, profoundly understood that genuine lasting power was absolutely never ultimately about aggressively shouting loudly inside glass boardrooms or vainly wearing incredibly expensive tailored designer suits or maliciously, cruelly belittling completely vulnerable, hardworking, innocent people. He clearly, definitively recognized that those shallow, pathetic, highly performative corporate behaviors were explicitly, entirely, simply the extremely fragile, incredibly weak, hollow, desperate disguises entirely actively worn by truly deeply pathetic, remarkably cowardly, completely terrified, little men entirely, utterly, absolutely devoid of any genuine, true, solid internal substance. True, undeniable, absolute, fierce power. DeAndre quietly, brilliantly realized was entirely, explicitly, beautifully, firmly, silently grounded, exclusively in relentless, meticulous, careful, flawless preparation. Real, enduring, generational strength was simply the absolute, quiet, unbreakable iron willingness to successfully, proactively, strategically, relentlessly, aggressively, patiently, legally, thoroughly, cleanly, successfully, safely, effectively, entirely, absolutely, securely, unconditionally, physically, structurally, financially, thoroughly, unconditionally, safely, actively, effectively, legally, seamlessly, effortlessly, securely, entirely, flawlessly, unconditionally, absolutely, permanently, safely, perfectly, purely, gracefully, naturally, completely, do whatever was strictly, entirely, fundamentally, explicitly, completely, flawlessly, successfully, beautifully, entirely, unconditionally, permanently necessary to, entirely, completely, flawlessly, seamlessly, correctly, strongly, fiercely, protect your own precious, vital, sacred blood. He sipped his warm coffee completely, entirely, profoundly, deeply, securely, perfectly, incredibly, completely, safely. The massive front oak door of the meticulously preserved original brick house smoothly swung open, revealing the legendary mechanic to the world. Tyrone calmly stepped directly out onto the newly poured, pristine concrete driveway. He was proudly wearing the exact same heavily faded, worn canvas jacket and the scuffed, battered steel-toe work boots that he had defiantly worn on the terrible cold morning of his unjust corporate eviction. He slowly stretched his stiff, aging muscles, completely silently absorbing the absolute, pure, tranquil, majestic morning atmosphere surrounding his incredible new physical domain today. He completely, decisively ignored the newly constructed, highly secured, climate-controlled luxury garage located adjacent to the sprawling main residential structure. Inside that immaculate, beautifully lit, spotless modern building rested several extremely expensive, perfectly polished, highly advanced, sleek imported luxury automobiles, freely, permanently, legally belonging to his incredibly wealthy, newly restored family. Tyrone absolutely did not walk anywhere remotely near those gleaming, flawless, shiny, expensive, lavish machines. His incredibly fierce, entirely authentic working-class identity required absolutely zero modern validation. He confidently, steadily, purposefully walked perfectly straight across the pristine driveway directly toward his battered, heavily dented, deeply scratched, remarkably reliable, exceptionally beautiful, undeniably beloved, entirely, incredibly, heavily worn, wonderfully sturdy, explicitly, perfectly, entirely, absolutely, exceptionally beautiful, heavily weathered, reliable, classic vintage American steel. This beloved truck represented his enduring strength, carrying the undeniable weight of decades of honest labor. He gently touched the weathered hood, feeling the familiar cold metal beneath his fingertips. Tyrone possessed an unshakable connection to this simple machine. It was a perfect testament to his humble roots, surviving every brutal storm and every vicious corporate attack with pure resilience. He stood silently for a brief moment, breathing deeply, completely, ready to finally drive his beautifully flawless, completely, incredibly, exceptionally, perfectly, remarkably, unconditionally beloved Ford truck. Tyrone calmly grasped the cool silver handle and smoothly opened the heavy metal door of the battered truck. He hoisted his massive frame inside, sitting comfortably on the severely worn leather bench seat. He firmly grasped the steering wheel, deeply feeling the incredibly familiar grooves etched into the tough material. He decisively turned the key in the ignition. The powerful engine sputtered briefly, protesting the early morning chill, then suddenly roared directly to life with a beautifully steady, perfectly enduring hum. The incredibly deep mechanical vibration actively resonated smoothly throughout his entire chest, fully grounding him entirely in the present moment. He confidently shifted the sturdy transmission firmly into gear and pressed the heavy accelerator pedal. The incredibly reliable vehicle rolled perfectly forward slowly, carrying him safely down the pristine, newly paved winding driveway. He drove peacefully away from the massive, towering compound, smoothly disappearing directly into the thick, beautiful, glowing early morning mist. Tyrone Carver was simply a deeply profound, incredibly authentic, remarkably brilliant, completely unyielding, exceptionally humble, fiercely loving, entirely honorable, wonderfully wise, perfectly resolute, extraordinarily steadfast, thoroughly dedicated, quiet man whose absolutely flawless, silent adjustments miraculously changed the entire physical world, absolutely forever today, safely, without fail. Share your thoughts on the Carver family's silent victory in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more compelling stories of resilience and redemption.